Excuse me, Your Worship, you're live whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Stephanie. All right, Council, it's 2 p.m. and I will call our Strategic Initiative Standing Committee to order for November 29, 2021. I will start off with the land acknowledgement. For more than 15,000 years, the First Nations walked upon and cared for the lands we now call home. Anishinaabek, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and many others who were families, friends, and communities the way we are today. The town of Collingwood acknowledges the Lake Simcoe-Nottawasaga Treaty of 1818 and the relationship it establishes with the original inhabitants of Turtle Island. We acknowledge the reality of our shared history and the current contributions of Indigenous peoples within our community. We seek to continue empowering expressions of pride amongst all of the diverse stakeholders in this area. We seek to do better and to continue to recognize, learn, and grow in friendship and community, nation to nation. I'll look for a motion to adopt the agenda, and the resolution reads that the content of the Strategic Initiative Standing Committee agenda for November 29, 2021 be adopted as presented. Can I get a mover and a seconder? Councillor Madigan and Councillor Berman. Are there any questions, comments before I call the vote? Seeing none, I will call the vote. All in favor? That is carried unanimously. Thank you. Before we get into the agenda, though, I would like to read a statement on behalf of town and council. The town has received notice from Deputy Mayor Hall that he will be taking a temporary leave of absence effective immediately. Currently, the Deputy Mayor also sits as a county councillor, BIA director, and member of the Development and Operations Standing Committee, Emergency Control Group, and Affordable Housing Task Force. Council will have to meet in the near future to discuss requirements and the necessity for interim appointments or delegation of authority during his absence. The Deputy Mayor has been an active and passionate member of our council and county council, acting on behalf of our community and our constituents. I would ask council, staff, and our community that we respect the Deputy Mayor's privacy. And I know I speak for all of us when I say we look forward to his return to council table early in the new year. That brings us to item 3, which is declarations of pecuniary interest. Are there any declarations, council? Seeing none, if you find yourself in that situation as we progress, please let us know. And that brings us then to item 4, which is the interim control bylaw updates. And I will turn it over to CEO Skinner, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. There will be the normal deck on screen. Great. And we have a big agenda today. So I think I will point out any, largely point out changes in the update for council and the public today. The next slide. So this is the resolution on slide 2 that this deck addresses the request from council for updates. Slide 3. And our situation is laid out here, and we do really want people to know the water supply is safe and available. Council's been very proactive. We've had most of our development applications approved. In fact, all that were ready to go, and I'll tell you more a bit about that as we go through the deck. Next slide, please. So the first half of the deck is about the water capacity or the plant itself, or plant and its expansion. So what's happened recently, very good news on the permit to take water. It's been expanded at around 7 megaliters a day, 6 megaliters a day to 58. The pre-selection of membrane treatment process RFP closes today, November 29th. So that's a big step forward. I hope we will find we've had a lot of qualified bidders with great products and good prices. And we also have had in the last couple of days on November 23rd, public engagement sessions with the development community and the general public. And so the Zoom recordings are available if anyone's interested at engagecollingwood.ca. And most importantly, written comments are welcome until December 3rd. So this public engagement sessions talked about the allocation of water in the future and how council can fairly, openly, transparently, and with the values of the community in mind, allocate water to the continued building of a complete community in Collingwood. Engage Collingwood is at engagecollingwood.ca, and you can also Google the town of Collingwood, and the Engage site is one of the first things that come up. There's a big button there. Next slide, please. No changes to the schedule for the expansion, and we remain on track. Next slide, please. Also, no changes to the remaining water supply. However, there is a report that will be before SIC today that talks about several new exemptions that have come forward recently that if approved by council would adjust the remaining allocation, but no changes today. Next slide, please. Second half of the deck is about the planning policy study update. Next slide. And the exemptions that have already been approved by council in July, you can find out more information if you have any questions through the planning and building departments. And I think everybody who has received one has been re-notified. I know they've been re-notified, so you should know the status if you have one in already. Next step, please. The land use planning policy study is on track, and I was happy that we were able to move that blue arrow down slightly. So we're looking at having met to review the comments from the public and the development community and engineers. And we're just in the preparation, the consultants in the preparation with the planning department of version 2 of the report with any adjusted recommendations based on the input. Next slide, please. And the target timeline we introduced last week, and there have been no updates to that target timeline. We are on track. The key message here is that if we are able to stay on this this path, mid-March of 2022 will be the last day for appeals. And shortly thereafter, and within the 1-year duration of the interim control bylaw, council would be able to lift the bylaw and move to the new water allocation approach. However, if the zoning bylaw is appealed, we would need to extend or ask council to extend the interim control bylaw until such appeals are completed. Next slide, please. This is a timely update. As of today, we now have the building permit applications received, issued, dwelling permits issued, and occupancy permits issued within this year. The numbers in brackets are from last year, simply as a comparison. So you'll see that we're on track or ahead of where we were last year with respect to building permits. The only one where we're behind compared to last year, 2020, is in occupancy permits, which would make sense. That happens at the end of the building when one is able to occupy. And we did have a break in a pause from April to May and July while we sorted out exemptions with council to the interim control bylaw. So I think those will also catch up, but there's lots of building underway in Collingwood. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide. It's the same one as has been used in the past, but we have updated it. The CBO has updated it. The dark blue, so in the left side of the slide, it says 35%. That's the percentage of the exempted projects, so the ones for 2021, that have their building permits and are underway. The 20% in the medium blue, the little lighter blue, are the ones that we've received at the town, the building permit applications. And there's 45% of the exempted projects that we have not yet received building permits for. So there's a lot more building that could be proceeding in Collingwood right now if people were ready to submit for their permits and move forward. The right pie chart is the same information, but just showing by percentage of the water used. So you'll see while there's only 35% of the projects have gone forward, it actually accounts to 44% of the water that council had approved as exemptions. And I believe that's the last slide, so I'll turn it back to the chair, and myself and the directors will answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, CAO. Council, any questions or comments on the presentation today? Seeing none, then we will move on to our first staff report, and that's item 5.1. CAO 2021-15 interim control bylaw number 2021-24 exemption requests, commercial projects with no additional water capacity and accessory residential units. And I will look to Director Summer, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good afternoon to everybody. I would offer a brief summary of the staff report at this time. So as noted in CAO Skinner's presentation, though the ICBL interim control bylaw does remain in effect, work continues for those shovel-ready projects that have received an exemption to the bylaw. And as she mentioned, exemptions for those larger scale development projects were considered in the summer of 2021. And the subsequent council resolution did direct staff to hold off on the advancement of further requests until completion and implementation of the land use planning policy study, which was also covered in her presentation. However, the same staff report did suggest that exemptions for industrial, commercial, or institutional projects that neither required additional water capacity nor a planning application could be advanced for consideration of council. We have received 2 such requests for changes of use within existing commercial buildings. Both of the proposed uses are permitted in the zoning bylaw, and only internal renovations are being proposed. And therefore, that means that there's no planning applications that's required to advance the proposals. Both applicants have also indicated that no additional water capacity is needed to support the change of use. So staff have reviewed those 2 requests against the council approved criteria and are recommending that exemptions from the interim control bylaw be granted for both of those properties. Further, you'll see in the report that since the last round of exemptions were dealt with over the summer, there have been several requests to exempt residential properties from the interim control bylaw, and that would be for the purpose of constructing an accessory residential unit. And those are also known as basement apartments or accessory apartments, secondary dwelling units, coach houses. They go by a lot of different names. In the final report from the Affordable Housing Task Force, the importance of these accessory residential units was emphasized as one of the key pillars in combating the housing crisis. And land use legislation and policy at all levels of government also recognize the importance of accessory dwelling units and support any way that we as municipalities can streamline approvals or permits to establish these uses. So currently, and in accordance with council's resolution, any proposal for accessory residential units would not be eligible for an ICBL exemption until after the completion of the land use policy study. But when staff looked at the number of this type of construction that occurs in the town in a given year and looked at the amount of capacity that would be needed to support those uses, it was determined that both of those are relatively low. So what we're suggesting in the staff report is the benefits for attainable and affordable housing likely outweigh the risk of considering further exemptions for those types of uses. And should committee and council agree with that perspective, that we would look at exemptions for accessory residential units on a case-by-case basis, we do have one application in play at this time, which is summarized in the staff report, and that is for 39th Street. The capacity allocation that would be required to support that proposal is 0.66 of a single dwelling or SDU equivalent. And the application does indicate that affordable housing would be created through this construction. So just to quickly highlight that in advance of this meeting, there was a question that was asked of staff of whether there was a mechanism to tie an exemption request to ensuring that the unit that would be created would be affordable over the long term. There's certainly other senior managers on this call that could speak to this issue, but I, at this time, am not aware of a mechanism that would be available in the absence of a planning application, as well as a framework of policies, processes, and standards that would be in place. And the example that I would offer is at the upper tier level. Often there's grants for accessory residential units, and those grants are tied to agreements that are registered on title that require long-term affordability, but those are in a larger system where the rules are known upfront when the individual makes the application. In reviewing the other exemption requests that Council considered over the summer, there were several for accessory residential dwelling units, and staff has suggested that at this point, to be fair and transparent, we deal with those requests in the same way, which would not allow for additional criteria to be added or an agreement be entered into for to ensure long-term affordability. That being said, there's likely future opportunities with the appropriate policies and procedures in place to investigate something of that nature. At this point, Council would need to weigh the request against the likelihood that the unit would be affordable, attainable, or otherwise available to a vulnerable group such as an elderly parent wishing to age in place, needing a little bit of help, but also wanting to stay independent, for example. Before I conclude the remarks on this report, Your Worship, I did also want to let the committee know that since the agenda was posted, we've received 2 other requests for an exemption, ICBL exemptions. One is for a basement accessory residential unit on Robinson Street, and the intent for that unit would be to rent it out to the organization E3 Community Services. And the second request is for a dwelling to be constructed on Grey County Road 19 in the rural residential designation. In that particular case, water and wastewater services are not available, so that development would occur on a private well and septic system, and it's currently permitted in the zoning bylaw. So at this time, we would propose that the staff report that you see in your agenda package be updated to include analysis and recommendation of those additional 2 requests for consideration at the December 13th Council. Thank you, Your Worship. That concludes the opening remarks I had about the staff report, and happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Director Valentine. And as this is an SIC meeting, I'll look to Deputy Clerk Dahl to see if there's anyone from our audience that would like to speak or comment on this staff report.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. I'll call to the public. We do have some attendees today. If you're wanting to speak to this item, if you could please press the raise your hand feature. And it appears that no one wishes to speak to this item at this time.
Thank you, Deputy Clerk. So I'll read the resolution in to get it on the floor. That staff report CAO 2021-15 interim control bylaw number 2021-24 exemption requests commercial projects with no additional water capacity and accessory residential units be received. And further, that the lands identified as 269 6th Street and 146 Hurontario Street be exempt from the provisions of the interim control bylaw number 2021-24 and added to the bylaw schedule A for the purpose of establishing a personal service shop and business office respectively with no additional water capacity allocation. And further, that in recognition of the housing affordability crisis, exemption requests for accessory residential units be reviewed and advanced for consideration by council on a case-by-case basis. And further, that should council deem it desirable to consider exemption requests for accessory residential units, the lands identified as 39th Street be exempt from the provisions of interim control bylaw number 2021-24 and added to the bylaw schedule A with an additional water capacity allocation of 0.66 single detached unit equivalents. Can I get a mover and a seconder for that, please? Moved by Councillor MacLeod and seconded by Councillor Jeffrey. I'll open the floor for questions or comments from council. Councillor Doherty.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Valentine, for such a thorough report. You and I spoke on Friday and you answered all of my questions. I'll just state in general terms that I'm very delighted to support these recommendations. Any initiative that's going to create jobs in our community is certainly welcome in our community. It's just, I just feel, as we embark on affordable housing strategy, that it's so unfortunate that we have an opportunity with the first two exemptions that there is existing accessory that they are not proposing to implement at this time. And it would be terrific if there was some way that we could incent the addition of mixed use residential wherever possible. Just for the public, I will ask you this question. There are grants available for the creation of accessory residential for private residences. Are these grants also available for commercial ventures?
Director Valentine?
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to the councillor. Just quickly before addressing the question, one clarification which might be of assistance to the committee. In the case of the two requests to change the commercial uses without additional water capacity, 269 6th Street does have an accessory residential apartment unit already associated with that use. It's just that they're not proposing any changes, updates, or renovations. It's my understanding that that apartment is already rented and will continue to do so. And the case of 146 here Ontario Street, that does also include 5 accessory residential units as well, which they are renovating through the same building permit. But because that's not a change of use, it didn't need an exemption. So if that provides any comfort to the committee that there is mixed use proposed for both of these, that is indeed the case. And then Councillor Doherty, I'd have to get back to you on the answer to your question about whether the accessory dwelling unit funding that's available at the county level would also be for accessory dwelling units associated with commercial ventures and not just those that are constructed within an existing residential dwelling. So we can investigate that, and unless perhaps others who are on the call today that have been part of the Affordable Housing Task Force may know that answer right off the top of their head. But if that's not the case, we can certainly provide that to committee and council.
Thank you, Director.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Council, any other questions or comments before I call the vote? Seeing none, I will comment certainly that I'm in favor of these exemptions, but also as pointed out by the CAO Skinner in her report, we are ahead of where we were in building starts this year and building permits issued. That is good news. Back in April 26, we were hearing doom and gloom stories from numerous developers and their representatives, and that has not come to pass. And when the dust settles and we lift our interim control bylaw, we will have an allocation framework, which is an essential piece of good planning moving forward for this community. So I see that we have pushed through this issue, and we are moving forward on every front to get our water capacity increased and our new plant expansion up online by end of 2025 and 2026. And in the interim, we've still maintained development levels in our community. And it's good to see that we are getting rental units online, because that will help to ease in some respects by adding to the inventory the crisis. And anything that we can do at this point in time is an important step forward given the severity of the crisis. So with that being said, I will call the vote. All in favor? That is carried unanimously. Thank you. And that brings us then to item 5.2, C 2021-24, 2021 Town of Collingwood Procurement Bylaw. And I will pass it over to Clerk Alness and Manager Truman.
Thank you, Your Worship. We are excited to bring the updates forward on our procurement bylaw. It has taken a significant amount of research, review, consultation to bring this forward. Manager Truman will be providing the presentation this evening, but I'd also like to give a big kudos to our purchasing officer, Rose Hewitson, who is also available should any questions arise from the presentation today. But it's a great enhancement towards meeting some of our recommendations pertaining to procurement from the Collingwood Judicial Inquiry. So I'll let Michael take it away.
Thank you very much, Clerk Almas, and I can see that the presentation has started. Can we start on slide 2, please? So yeah, thanks everybody for the opportunity to present today. I wanted to provide a little bit of background just in terms of where we've been and how we got and what we're trying to address here. So the current procurement bylaw was created in 2017 and was crafted to improve the overall openness and fairness of the town's procurement processes. It also stated in the bylaw that it should be reviewed every 5 years, and we're coming up on that 5-year term now. So this is why we undertook this at the moment. Also, the Collingwood Judicial Inquiry report was released in fall 2020 and highlighted several key areas of improvement for the town's procurement. The development of the 2021 procurement bylaw, staff endeavored to continue to strengthen our commitments to fair and competitive procurement, better training for department staff, step-by-step procedures and for the various types and phases of procurement, and policies around environmentally sustainable and accessible procurement, and a greater awareness of group purchasing opportunities with with other municipalities and the province. Next slide, please. So how we crafted this particular document, the staff conducted a thorough review of the Collingwood Judicial Inquiry report to ensure that what we developed adhere to the high fair ethical standards that were pointed out in the report, and to ensure that they were included as they should be with all levels of government procurement. Also, departmental workshops were held to review the current bylaw to kind of find out what was working well, what could be improved on, and input was documented and considered and used wherever possible. We also consulted with our newly appointed climate change specialist, Nicole Yardy, to update the commitments to sustainable procurement. And to get their continued support as we develop specific sustainable practices and procedures. We also took the opportunity to engage with the Accessible Advisory Committee to gather their input on how the bylaw could improve the town's considerations for people with accessibility needs. And also a judicial scan was completed with several of the municipal bylaws and several trade agreements to ensure that consistency was inputted where required. Next slide, please. So just some of the updates, some of the other updates that we tried to address in this particular bylaw. We've updated new definitions, added some new sections, and also added some specific roles and responsibilities. So for one, we've accurately identified that procurement falls under the clerk's department and not the finance department. We have better defined roles for project staff and also for the purchasing staff. We've included my position, the position of the accountability, procurement, and risk management manager. And we've also updated this, as mentioned in previous slides, we've also updated the sections to address the town's commitment to environmentally sustainable and accessible procurement, and also several other different adjustments to kind of make this a more modern and usable bylaw for staff and for potential suppliers. Next slide, please. So this table just highlights a quick comparison of where we are currently in terms of our current financial delegated levels, in terms of what is a low cost purchase, an invitational purchase, and when we go out to open market. And it should just be noted that Collingwood currently has the lowest threshold of any of the municipalities that I reviewed in Ontario. And the most common figure right now for bylaws that I was reviewing, and they were all updated, I would say between 2019 to 2021, all show a low cost procurement value of around $10,000. Next slide, please. And so this is where we get to the new delegated financial limits. So we are, I just, at this particular point, I just want to kind of add a little bit of additional background. The 2006 bylaw, which was the bylaw that was replaced by our current one, we actually had quite a high low cost limit that was around $25,000. In this report and in this bylaw, we're not recommending we raise the levels back up to anything close to that, but we think that a raise of the low cost purchasing limit to $7,500 would still be able to maintain a high level of openness and transparency, while also kind of keeping things in line with what we're seeing in terms of overall pricing. Also, we can confirm that these limits do keep the town in compliance with the Canadian Fair Trade Agreement and the Canadian European Union Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement as well. So yeah, you can see here in the table that we've adjusted the levels, and that's what's in the actual bylaw in the staff report. Next slide, please. So two items that were brought up that we understand are of great importance to everybody was local purchasing. So we did undertake a review of that, and we did, we did kind of in the end realize that anything that we would do to kind of position us to favor local more strongly could find us not in compliance, could see us, could see us kind of come up against the Discriminatory Business Practices Act, which does specifically state that geographical location should not be considered when going out to business. And also there are compliant measures within the CFTA and the CEFTA. However, we did see in some other different municipal bylaws that there was an option to add a tie break option in the points in the case of an actual point awarded tie, where you could decide to award the contract to a local vendor in that particular situation. So that's something that we did see that we felt we could include in this particular document. Also, something that was brought up relatively close to publishing was the idea of pinning something to a fair or living wage. We did do a scan of what other municipalities were doing, and we did see a similar policy in a few large Ontario municipalities. But in the end, we did determine that it seemed like it would be quite a large undertaking at this particular time. They seemed to have teams that kind of constantly reviewed what was happening in the economic trends in the area, and also would review each of the procurement files to make sure that anyone that was going to be potentially awarded business with the municipality did adhere to what they considered a living wage standard. So at this particular time, we didn't feel like the town of Collingwood staff could undertake something quite that large. But it is something we would like to explore moving forward. And so next slide, please. And so, sorry, excuse me. Just to kind of highlight what we're hoping to do next, once approved, the purchasing division will be taking the responsibility of updating all of our existing templates and creating new procedures, and also ensure procurement training for the appropriate town staff as identified in the 2022 operational plan. When procurement division has the capacity, we will focus our attention on concepts like the fair wage policy, fair trade, and sustainable and circular procurement. And just kind of a comment to close it out, we do understand that procurement is rarely a static enterprise. Changes come from the federal and provincial level. Legal precedents are set on a fairly consistent basis, and new best practices and methodologies are often deployed at all of the different levels. And we hope to be able to stay on top of those things and implement them where we can. This bylaw positions Collingwood to continue to be a leader in accountability and transparency, while encouraging a high level of trust and confidence in our policies. So the next slide is the last one. It's just any questions.
Thank you very much, Manager Truman. Deputy Clerk Dahl, I'll look to you to see if there's anyone from our audience that would like to comment on this presentation.
Thank you, Your Worship. It does look like someone has their hand raised. I'm not quite sure it is, so if they can identify themselves when we allow them to speak. There you go.
My name is John McGarry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. McGarry. Go ahead, please.
I reside at 15 Sunset Court in Collingwood. The bylaw as proposed exempts legal services procurement from transparency under MFIPA regulations. This council has expended millions of dollars on legal services before, during, and after the CJI. All of it was single sourced. Ironically, one of the issues leading to the CJI, and not subject to the fair, open, or competitive bidding procedure that this procurement bylaw calls for. Additionally, all of that money is cloaked in secrecy under MFIPA so that the public may not see what is included in these billings. Lawyers are one of the very few of the town's vendors who are afforded this courtesy. And by the way, they are not specifically listed in Schedule A of your draft bylaw. Virtually every other vendor whether construction company, consultant, or janitorial services provider is subject to competitive bidding and public exposure of their pricing. My suggestion that I hope council will adopt is to include legal services in the requirement for RFP and open, fair, and competitive bidding. The bylaw should require that bidders must agree, bidders on legal services, that is, must agree that they waive the AMFIPA secrecy condition in order to bid. Lawyers not willing to do so would be barred from the town of Collingwood's bids. Last week's Globe and Mail report on Business Magazine stated that there are 30,000 law firms in Canada, 200 or so designated as the top law firms in the nation. Surely there are plenty of them that are hungry enough for business or ethical enough to bid for Collingwood's business under these conditions. So I request, remove the cloak of secrecy around lawyer billings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGarry. And I could advise you that our counsel for the inquiry was not sole sourced. Rebecca, is there anyone else who would like to speak to us?
Thank you, Your Worship. If there's anyone wishing to speak to this item, if you could please press the raise your hand feature. And there's no one else wishing to speak at this time.
Thank you, Deputy Clerk. I'll read the resolution in. The staff report C 2021-24, 2021 Town of Collingwood Procurement Bylaw be received, and further the council enact and pass the 2021 updated procurement bylaw as presented herein. Can I get a mover and a seconder, please? Councillor Madigan and Councillor Hamlin, and I'll open the floor to questions from council. Okay, Councillor Jeffrey, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. So I know we referred a couple of times in the presentation to consultation and attention from the climate specialist. And I was surprised by that because when I read through it, I thought, oh, we haven't made any headway with respect to climate and changes. And given the conditions of our east and west coast, in real time, that's something we really need to be making headway. So I'm wondering through to the CAO if Sonia could just maybe outline for me how we were able to strengthen or do better with the climate issues in procurement. And I did notice that Councillor Doherty had asked a question this afternoon with respect to concrete that does not emit the GHGs of regular concrete. And I know through my contacts at FCM, it's the same price as regular concrete. We just have to know enough to ask for it. So those are the kind of initiatives I'm looking for through our procurement. So.
CAO Skinner.
Thank you, Your Worship. I do know that we have just recently hired the climate change specialist, and that she had provided some comments to Manager Truman and the clerk on this report. But I think the substance of the report really says we need to do some more work in this area. So it is a great point, and we need to think further through that. Some of the things that become challenging under the current legal paradigm are things like the free trade laws, and those don't allow us to procure, easily procure, for example, local to reduce transport, which of course would reduce greenhouse gases. And one thing I will add before I ask the clerk or Manager Truman, because I wasn't in the actual conversations with the climate change specialist, but did get briefed afterwards, is that Councillor Doherty did raise, I believe just over a year ago, the question about greenhouse gas, less greenhouse gas being emitted from certain types of concrete. And we have left that with the engineering group. One of the challenges was making sure that we get a standard for people to bid upon that shows the requirements for that type of concrete. So within the construction contract, you'd have your standards. So I can follow up again with engineering just to see where that is, because it had been raised previously. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll look to Manager Truman. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Thank you, Your Worship, through you to Councillor Jeffrey. Yeah, the discussions that I had with the climate specialist Yardi were around the idea that, you know, we can develop those kinds of more environmentally sustainable benchmarks when developing the criteria for an individual RFP, depending on what the program is. And so we can say that we would prefer to see items listed specifically as what we would want to see, and whether that is, you know, a more environmentally sustainable product or an option like that. Those things need to be done at the project planning phase. And we do hope to develop a more comprehensive environmentally sustainable procedure document that can help staff and how to ask those questions, where to approach the climate change specialist to get their input. So yeah, we hope to have something pretty comprehensive that will help when we're developing those documents to go out to market.
Thank you, Manager. Any follow-up, Councillor?
No other questions, but just to say thank you, and I would just kind of convert the word to hope to will look for every opportunity. So in terms of our comments on local, it has always been problematic, and I do think the report did note the fact that while it may make it better for some local businesses, other local businesses do rely on other municipalities for the income for their businesses. And if it's the same as the Buy American thrust down in the US is that you kind of cut off your nose to spite your face, and because it does go both ways with our businesses locally. So I just wanted to make that comment. Specifically with 9.2B in the procurement bylaw, and I don't have the wording up here in front of me, but I will. It is the monitoring by the CAO as to the seriousness or repetitive breaches in the protocol. And it concerned me, only two words that I would like to amend and remove is the words as warranted. Because the responsibility of the CAO to report to council, I suggest that as warranted would give the idea that it becomes subjective as opposed to objective as to what the limits of the seriousness and repetitiveness of serious infractions that council would want to hear about. And I guess my frame of mind is I would want to hear about them all. I don't really feel like that's the kind of spectrum the CAO should have in terms of those serious considerations. So I just was wondering if the clerk and or the CAO through you, Mayor Saunderson, would like to comment to the intent of those two words.
Thank you, Councillor Jeffrey. Who would like to take that question? CAO Skinner? Or Sarah, do you have CAO had her mic open and okay, go ahead, Clerk Almas.
Certainly, Your Worship. That wording was the original wording that's been contained in our bylaw. And thinking about the removing of as warranted, I don't have any significant concern. I agree that removing the, subjectiveness from the conversation probably is a good idea. And if the CAO has any further comments otherwise, then I'll leave that to her.
Thank you, Sarah. CAO?
Thank you, Your Worship. I have no concern with the removal of the as warranted and the reporting of serious or repetitive incidents of non-compliance to council.
I'll come back to you, Councillor Jeffrey, when we put this on the table.
Okay, and then just one other clarification I need in 23.1, all unsolicited proposals. I believe that there have been unsolicited proposals that have come through to council and were going to be referred back to us, but kind of disappeared in our internal process somewhere. And how can council be assured that something that we receive does in fact get considered? I mean, sometimes things can be presented to us as the be all and end all in comparison to anything that we've considered. But I would still like the assurance at the end of the day that it was actually put into the mix and considered. I have a specific example, but I'm just going to try to ask it generally and see what the clerk and or the CAO could provide through you, Mayor Saunderson.
Thank you. Clerk Thomas.
Thank you, Your Worship. To Councillor Jeffrey, the concern about understanding if appropriate attention has been provided to an unsolicited proposal. So all of our procurements, all of unsolicited proposals are tracked and monitored. So I sometimes I'm trying to think of an example offhand that happened in the last probably 3 years where it came to our attention. I believe council was apprised of it. And then upon further review, it wasn't deemed to be a unique proposal that would meet the unsolicited proposal guidelines. And then it ends at that point. Unless council is looking for, you know, a reporting structure, we have to be cautious with unsolicited proposals because generally they contain some unique or proprietary information and not generally posted publicly until they've been discussed and vented through the appropriate departments for approvals. I'm not sure if that necessarily addresses your question, if the CAO has something further to add to that component.
CAO.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you also to Councillor Jeffrey. I've only run through the unsolicited proposals in practice once or twice since I've been in this position. I do believe the process requires, should the unsolicited proposal move forward, that one department head would sponsor or look at that initiative as something that should be, you know, have potentially a benefit to the town and should receive the attention of council. Because we do receive a lot that are more sales calls than potentially true unsolicited proposals tailored for the benefit of Collingwood. But that could be another reason why some things have not come back through, because they didn't receive sponsorship that's set out in the current unsolicited proposals policy. Thank you.
Follow up, Councillor.
Just one of my last, so then it would be appropriate through you, Mayor Saunderson, to the CEO or the clerk for a council member to follow up on something they've seen on the consent agenda to have the discussion offline that it actually was run through the process. Is that appropriate?
Clerk Thomas, I see the clerk's nodding, so
that's fine. I just wanted to say it out loud for everybody.
Yes,
Okay.
that would be appropriate.
Great. All right. Those are my questions so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and don't let me forget about your amendment. So bring that up if I forget. Any other questions or comments, Council? Councillor McLeod, then Councillor Hamlin, then Councillor Doherty.
Thank you. A couple of questions and a clarification that I'm going to seek. Would the changes that are proposed in this new amended procedural bylaw have prevented the events that led us to the judicial inquiry? And I'm talking particularly about the sole sourcing of the, excuse me, the BLT bubbles and the money that the mayor's brother got for a success fee from that.
So Clerk Thomas, go ahead, sir.
Certainly, thank you, Your Worship. To answer Councillor McLeod's question, we did do substantial changes to the 2017 version of the bylaw. And I think the additional enhancements that we provided in here, but I think our changes within that 2017 would have helped address the concerns with sole sourcing back then. And then we have the further refinements around competitive, fair, transparent procurement strengthened because of the recommendations of the JI in this 2001 version.
2021, great.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you. And my other is more of a request for a clarification. We had a member of the public just speaking a moment ago about how much was spent on lawyers' fees and so on. And I know that the JI was much more expensive than anyone had anticipated or hoped for by far. But have we spent millions of dollars after the JI came out on lawyers' fees? Through you, Mayor Saunderson, to whomever is keeping track of such things. Is it millions?
Clerk Thomas.
Certainly, I can. I don't have the figures in front of me, but if, after the JI has been included, we have not spent millions of dollars. I can confirm that.
Thank you.
CAO Skinner.
Thank you, Your Worship. And we did just complete a competitive request for proposals for the town's legal services. So within the last 6 months or so, we did go to market with an open RFP evaluated on, I believe, 6 or so areas of specialty, so that we have competitive bidding and the appropriate skills available as staff and council need them at that competitive pricing. Thank you.
Thank you. Follow-up, Councillor.
Just further clarification, sorry, competitive bidding on lawyer work? Is that what you mean?
CAO.
Through you, Mayor, and Clerk Almus led this request for proposal, so she can help you with the details. And yes, it is for legal advice. Thank you.
Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Worship. To further elaborate, yes, we have actually went out. It's been approximately a year regarding various practice specialty areas. So then in the event that it's broken down, for example, employment law, municipal and planning law, infrastructure law, environmental law. So we then have the appropriate specialists in each area. In the event that we're looking for an expertise that may not be identified within the divisions that we have on retainer for our legal services RFP, then that is something that would be have to be reviewed through either an additional competitive process, or if it's something that meets a non-standard exemption, that could be explored. But obviously a competitive bid is primarily what we're looking for.
Thank you.
Councillor.
No, I'm good, thanks.
Good. Well, maybe just since you've raised this issue, which is an important issue, Clerk Thomas, maybe you can explain what aspects are confidential of the legal services under MFIPA.
Certainly, thank you, Your Worship. Under MFIPA, the actual billing rates are considered confidential information. The total amounts of bills are considered to be public information. This is something actually that we are currently looking at. We contemplated including considering provision within our proposed bylaw. However, we don't want to also exclude potential bidders from the process. If we're able to, during negotiations with them, ask them about their privacy policies with respect to billing, I think that would be something that we would be doing moving forward within our next RFP rounds. But again, it is something that is considered private and confidential.
Thank you for that. So just to clarify, it's the hourly billings, not the total amount of the bills themselves. And just for a little historical context, I will note that in the 2012 transaction, those legal fees were not provided to the public for about 5 years until Ms. Leonard provided it to council, and when ultimately asked by council to provide a breakdown of the legal fees and the costs of or how, actually, I think it was, the phrasing was how the proceeds from the sale of the utility were spent. So town was not aware of those, and the town has been aware at all points during the judicial inquiry of the cost of the judicial inquiry, to Mr. McGarry's point. I've got next Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Manager Truman. I find the area of procurement is one of those that is most complicated to our residents. And I think there's quite a bit of confusion in some people's mind, at least, as to the role council has in procurement. And by that, I mean, what role does individual council members have when it comes to choosing who should supply goods to the municipality, who should build something in the municipality, who should provide services to the municipality. And I was wondering if you could take a minute and explain what council's role is in that regard.
Clerk Thomas or Manager Truman, who would like to take that?
I can answer the question.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Hamlin. The separation really is in a couple of different key areas. Council approves the budget and approves the funding for specific operations, like specific projects. And then town staff then goes and takes away and they work through the process in order to go to market, to receive bids, to evaluate, and to present and to award based on the preset criteria. In terms of when council can and cannot get involved is around, like there is, there's a provision in here that says if there's a specific project that you would like to be updated on an ongoing basis, you can ask for that to happen. And so staff can come and report back to you along all steps along the way. There's also several other provisions if we're going to go ahead with, certain non-standards as well, that they can come and be reported back to council. But generally speaking, it is through your control of the budget that you have most of your input over what is procured and how it's and items like that.
Thank you, Manager. Follow-up, Councillor?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So just to be, really clear, would council be involved selecting who would be a winning bidder for goods to be provided to the town?
Manager Truman?
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Hamlin. No, we would establish evaluation committees to evaluate all the submissions against the RFP requirements. The evaluators are town staff members who traditionally have an expertise in the area that we're looking to procure the services in, and we award points set out by the rubrics and the matrix that we have established beforehand. And then we go on to pricing after all the technical scores have been awarded. So no, the short answer, the short version of the answer.
Okay.
Clerk Thomas, I see you've got your card up. Go ahead.
Certainly, to further elaborate on this, I think it's a great point. So section 8.3 of the bylaw does address this issue to avoid the potential appearance of bias or political influence in procurement contract award decisions. Members of council will have no involvement in competitive procurement. And I can tell you that procurement is a highly complex area that, yes, I completely agree that the general public has no idea the complexities and legislation and trade agreements that influence the requirements of bidding, and actually how highly litigious bidding can be as well, and why we need to make sure that we have all of these policies and processes in place, so then they can be held up should there be any question about our practices.
Thank you. Follow-up, Councillor?
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Doherty.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll thank my colleagues for covering off a number of questions that I had wanted to ask and get the answers to. Just two items in regard to our greener Collingwood considerations and that aspect of our procurement bylaw. It is mentioned that staff are continuing to research and prepare a policy for fair trade, sustainable and circular procurement. Wondering what is the timeline for this? I guess through you, either to Manager Truman or Clerk Almas.
Thank you, Councillor. Who would like to? Manager Truman, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Doherty. It would be our plan to, within the next calendar year, to deliver, to have, committed the resources to trying to establishing some policies and procedures around those items. Some of them, I obviously would be, we would want to prioritize the ones that we would like to address, in order of priority.
Follow-up, Councillor Doherty?
No, that's good. Another question. Section 16 deals with how to address the issue of equal bids or no acceptable bid. And in this case, specific criteria are identified as part of that item. So I'm wondering why in this case, and in particular, when we're trying to break a tie between two bidders, why we would not include a seventh criteria having to do with sustainability or circularity or GHG impact of the product or service for which we have requested bids.
Mr. Truman.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor Doherty. In terms of, I'll use the term tie breaking, an item like that could be considered. We would just have to establish what the benchmark was in the development of the RFP and to allow all bidders to be fully aware of what it might come down to should there be two successful proponents that have the exact same score. So it's not to say just like the benchmark would have to be kind of developed by, I would assume, the project team along with the procurement department. It would potentially be possible, but just with a high level of kind of background information to ensure that what we're establishing is fair and reasonable. There weren't a lot of examples of that. I can't think of any off the top of my head of other municipalities having a tie break similar to this. And so I'm not sure if something this has been something that has been challenged before. And so I don't know exactly what would happen if an unsuccessful supplier were to challenge us. If it were to come down to that, I don't really know what the town would be open to in that particular section.
Follow-up, Councillor.
Okay. So at this time, is it reasonable to ask for an amendment of this bylaw to include that parameter?
I'll come back to you, Councillor. I've got Councillor Jeffrey's amendment, and then I'll come back and you can put your amendment on the floor before we deal with the main motion.
Thank you, Your Worship. But what I was asking, is it reasonable at this time to add it in? Can we put that criteria in language that is open enough that the intent is clear and the details can be addressed later? That
So
question would be.
Staff. Yeah, my understanding is you're asking staff if that type of amendment can be prepared, and Clerk almost has her hand up. Go ahead, Sarah.
I'd rather not suggest it be included in this right now. Prior to this coming back to council, we'll include whether that can be considered. I know that the provisions for breaking ties is very prescriptive on what can be used and what can't. So we can identify that in the staff report when it comes forward and make a recommendation regarding that. I think we all feel a sense of, importance with climate change and these environmental sustainable procurements. So if there is an opportunity, it can be added to here. I think we would, and I recollect that there was a specific reason why we couldn't. So we will investigate that further and include it in the report when it comes back.
Does that assist, Councillor?
Yes, thank you very much, Clerk Almus. I do appreciate that. And then just finally, and this is just in regard to the comments that were made by Mr. McGarry relative to legal services. I'm so happy to hear that we are in process of surveying the marketplace for firms that can handle the various specialties that we will throw out to them from time to time. I was on the previous council where we did the same thing, and that was from what I could see at the time, a very thorough and competitive process. And again, like just for maybe the edification of the public, why would we not put out an RFP for matters as they come up?
Is that a question? I'll put that through then to perhaps Clerk Collins. Sarah?
Certainly. So there's a very limited amount of items that are exempt from procurements, and they're identified in the Schedule A to this bylaw. In items, they would include, they range from courses and workshops, newspapers when there's limited newspapers, although we do, where practical, we do competitive processes, like for our town page, for example, is something that's RFP'd, even though we have a provision to use one media outlet. Other services that we provide that only for an exemption would include honorariums, or if we require expert witnesses. We do have some specialty programs like municipal tax equity as provided in the annual budget. Staff recruitment services generally are not RFP'd. And again, these are items that when a department is looking at whether there's an exemption or not, they contact our procurement officer, and the procurement officer works through with them if there's a reasonableness, regardless if it's included in that Schedule A, on whether to conduct a competitive process. And I would say not many exemptions actually do we follow. I'm just looking at the schedule right now. They also include work to be performed on property and the provisions of a lease, warranty, or guarantee held in respect of the property or the original work, goods and services related to cultural or artistic fields, such as contracts to be awarded to a winner of a design contest, events supporting local nonprofit organizations, or some exemptions. But I would say more than 95% of our procurements undergo some form of competitive process.
Right. So I get, maybe I didn't frame my question properly. What I was asking is, we on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, matters come up that would require a legal opinion. Why would we just not go out into the marketplace to find a firm that can deal with that specific matter?
Okay, I think that goes a bit to the retainer process, but Clerk Thomas, maybe you can explain that.
My apologies, and I do appreciate that clarification.
As opposed to retainer.
The reason why we hold a retainer or a roster is for the fact that then we were required to go out for competitive quotes on every single one of those procurements. And procurement takes time, and to ensure that the information in the documents, a normal procurement process can take up to 6 to 8 weeks to conduct. And that's why we use a retainer system for various services, or a roster service or system for example, some of our engineering work for some of our development projects.
Great, thank you. That answers my question very well. And those are all my questions.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor, any other questions or comments on this? Councillor Berman.
Well, thank you, Mayor Saunderson. I think I have 3, and they're just clarifications, maybe a sentence or two just on what's in the staff report. The first one about staff are still receiving regular questions about the legal services, and I was just trying to maybe through you to the clerk or the CAO could gauge the level of concern from the public. Are we, when this says regular questions, do we have 50 and 100 people asking about this stuff a year later, or is it, maybe the same 2 or 3 people just asking the same question over again or in different ways? Is there someone that can answer that?
Clerk Thomas.
Certainly, thank you, Your Worship, and I'd have to gather exactly what section that was identified in.
Sorry.
I think it's at the
Regard-
bottom of page 3, bottom of page 3.
Okay. Yes, so with respect to this, we do have, I would say, 2 or 3 individuals that are quite concerned regarding the legal services. So right now we are dealing with a matter that's before adjudication, actually, with the Information Privacy Commissioner's Office regarding the hourly rates. And depending on how that adjudication goes, will provide whether the IPC thinks that those hourly rates can be disclosed, but generally the questions for legal services are around 2 to 3 individuals.
Hello, Councillor.
Thank you. Nope, on to the next one, if that's okay. Clarification on page 6 under the living/fair wage procurement. I was just looking, if I'm reading this right, clarification, does the town have employees that are currently not making a living wage?
Who's going to take that question?
You to whomever.
Yeah.
Thank you. During this procurement bylaw report review with department heads, our HR manager did confirm that we do have staff that do not make a living wage.
Thank you. Then I guess follow up through you, Mayor Saunderson, is that currently being addressed?
Clerk Thomas.
I'll leave that to CAO Skinner, Your Worship.
Yeah, okay. CAO Skinner.
Thank you, Your Worship. There is a certification that you can get related to a living fair wage. It's reasonably easy to find if you Google that online, or we could circulate. It's something like livingfairwage.ca or something similar to that. But it does set out what they consider to be a living or fair wage in different areas of Ontario. I believe that the rate for this area, and I'm going by memory, so I may be incorrect, but it was $19.05 was my recollection. And for that, we do have some positions, junior positions at the town that are paid below that rate, which is set by that, I believe it to be a nonprofit group, and it's separate from, for example, the minimum wage, of course, that is set by the provincial government. So we did just go through the hiring a third party to do due diligence on what we consider to be a P50 pay policy for jobs of that type. So I would say that at this time, we haven't been actively moving toward looking at the fair and living wage question further, but we're always open to direction from council should steps in that direction be desired. But we did go through a comprehensive process very recently that council has received and endorsed. Thank you.
Thank you. Follow up, Councillor.
I know follow up. My last question or clarification, if I could, Mayor Saunderson, through you to whomever, is under the effect on the town finances. The second paragraph that talks about a fairness monitor. If we could just, or if I could ask somebody just to maybe remind us what very, very briefly, the role, the cost per hour, and who decides, or is it prescripted where the fairness monitor is used? And I'll leave it with the answer to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to take that question?
I
Sarah?
can take that question.
Okay.
Thank you, Your Worship. That's a great question. And actually, we have been quite happy to have a fairness monitor on board. And I think their services have actually proven to save the town money in some of the areas where, there's questionable, deviations, from the policy. Sorry, I shouldn't say from the policy, from normal procurement for that matter. We have engaged with them. It's at the discretion of the CAO. However, they provide, objective advice on fairness and ethical procurement strategies. They also are, we've asked them to review procurement documents. And one of the benefits of having a fairness monitor is their services are under the $200 range, whereas our lawyers are generally over the $400 to $500 range.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Clerk Thomas. Council, any other questions or comments? Seeing none, I do have one, and either for Manager Truman or Clerk Almas. In the report, you talk about the reorganization that happened in 2019 and how the proposed amendments recognize the department shift as well as the intent of the CJI recommendations. And I'm just wondering if you can, for the benefit of the public, maybe explain that corporate shift and how it's augmented and improved our transparency and accountability.
Certainly. Thank you, Your Worship. I can take that question. Back in 2019, when there was the realignment of the procurement functions, since the procurement field is highly regulated, there's a lot of legislative requirements, there's a lot of legal interpretation that's required under the procurement components. It was felt at that time by our CAO that having basically a center of excellence for accountability would prove to be beneficial to the municipality. It was moved over to the clerk's department at that time. However, what we wanted to incorporate within this procurement bylaw, and you'll see a lot of provisions also relate to the duty of the treasurer. The treasurer has also fiduciary responsibility on behalf of the corporation. So we want to ensure that that fiduciary duty was also recognized within this bylaw. So basically, it captures the treasurer, the CAO, and myself regarding some of the areas that require some complete oversight on, but that was basically the background to the change in 2019. And I think that it has worked well. It has definitely been complemented by having a manager position as well, because it is highly complex, and having a centralized procurement is a very significant function for a municipality.
Thank you, Clerk Almas. That's very helpful. So I'm now going to look to Councillor Jeffrey. You had an amendment to remove some words out of, I think it was paragraph 16B 2.
Number 9, subsection 2B.
Okay. And you wanted to, as warranted, was that the wording?
Yes, remove the words as warranted.
All right. And can I get a seconder for that, please? Councillor Berman, are there any questions or comments on the amendment? Just dealing with the amendment now before I call the vote. Seeing none, all in favor? That is carried unanimously. Thank you. And then dealing with the main motion, I'll call the vote. All in favor? Oh, sorry, main motion as amended, just to be clear. And that is carried unanimously. Thank you very much. And that brings us then to item 5.3, CCS 2021-5, COVID-19 considerations and mandatory vaccination policy. And I will turn it over to Executive Director Peg, please.
Good afternoon, Your Worship. Thank you. So I will be providing the overview of the COVID-19 considerations vaccination policy staff report. And I will note that staff are reporting back on Council Resolution 325-2021 from October 25th. First slide, please. So as the global response to COVID-19 pandemic continues, new information does become available frequently. Most recently, as of Thursday last week, we've become aware globally of a new variant, Omicron, which the World Health Organization has included or indicated as a variant of concern. Recent reporting from the Simcoe-Muskoka District Health Unit indicates that cases in Simcoe-Muskoka continue to increase dramatically. The SMDHU COVID-19 monitoring dashboard has also moved to red status for the first time since the start of the third wave. Dr. Charles Gardner, so our local medical officer of health, has indicated that while vaccination is necessary and highly effective, it is insufficient on its own, given the high transmissibility and severity of the Delta variant of COVID-19 and the potential for breakthrough cases among the vaccinated. And as mentioned, research is being done on the newly discovered variant of concern, Omicron. The SMDHU has recently issued a letter of instruction that came out on November the 23rd to businesses and organizations within Simcoe and Muskoka. And this letter of instruction became effective on November 26th. It included instruction on COVID-19 safety plans, remote work, and active screening requirements. And this has been provided to council as an appendix to this report. The vaccination policy. So staff have prepared a mandatory COVID-19 vaccination policy, which is again included as an appendix to this report. In addition, staff have successfully implemented the council-approved mandatory COVID-19 vaccination disclosure policy. And I am pleased to report that 100% compliance in reporting status was achieved. The current policy includes a requirement for unvaccinated individuals to complete mandatory education and rapid antigen testing, and this has been rolled out. Sorry, thank you for switching the slide. Based on the current circumstances, staff recommend approval of the COVID-19 mandatory vaccination policy as proposed. In addition, that unpaid leaves of absence, which are referenced within the policy, be applied based on a role risk rating as determined by the Chief Administrative Officer to ensure a risk-based and defendable approach. Of course, this approach would be supported through occupational health and safety in the determination of a risk rating. In addition, it's recommended that the COVID-19 mandatory vaccine policy be in effect for a duration that aligns with federal, provincial, and Simcoe-Muskoka Health Unit requirements for proof of vaccine. For clarity and to ensure council continues to have an active role in the duration of the policy's application, the policy includes a statement that this policy will continue to apply until revoked by the town. The town will consider all federal, provincial, or local public health vaccine mandates, requirements, and recommendations when making that determination, and staff will continue to monitor these circumstances and report back to council in due course. Next slide, please. As part of council's resolution, staff were directed to report back to council on any additional resources that would be required to implement proof of vaccination screening at all town facilities, including any facilities that should be exempt from this requirement. Staff have reviewed the resources that would be required and have done so based on the lessons learned through the implementation of this requirement at provincially regulated facilities. So for example, the implementation at our recreation facilities. Based on this review, staff have identified that internal capacity is limited to provide this level of service based on current staffing levels without resulting in a decrease in services or programs in other areas, as staff would in essence need to be redeployed to this purpose. However, external contracts are possible. Costing is approximately $4,500 to $6,500 per facility per month based on regular operating hours. And this is currently an unbudgeted expenditure for facilities that are above the provincial requirement. So based on a number of factors, staff do not recommend proceeding in this direction at this time, but of course we would continue to monitor. Next slide, please. In the event that council did wish to proceed with mandatory proof of vaccination to enter facilities above those required by provincial legislation, staff would recommend that some exemptions be put in place. First and foremost, the exclusions in Ontario Regulation 364-20 need to be complied with. So for example, within that regulation, it provides that proof of vaccine is not required if a patron is entering an indoor area solely for the use of a washroom. So each of the town's facilities would need to maintain this exclusion. In addition, there are some facilities, for example, the transit terminals, where there could be some complications in implementation as they're unstaffed facilities. In addition, the public library, town hall, and facilities that are owned by the town and leased to third parties. And the report goes into detail on why exemptions for these facilities would be recommended. So again, based on several factors, staff do not proceed recommending in this direction at this time, but will continue to closely monitor as we move forward. Next slide, please. Council had also directed staff to move into pre-COVID settings for meetings effective January 1st, 2022. I did just want to highlight that there are exemptions in the proposed procedural bylaw that will allow for members to participate remotely or through a hybrid environment. And staff recommend that council consider this in the finalization of the procedural bylaw. So should any changes to that direction of January 1st be warranted, they would be considered through that bylaw. In addition, Dr. Charles Gardner did also provide a letter regarding practices to prevent COVID-19 transmission while conducting municipal council meetings, and staff have provided that as an appendix to this report for council's information. Next slide, please. Town hall customer service hours. So absolutely, customer service will be open 5 days a week as directed by council on or before January 1st of 2022. And currently in-person services are available at Town Hall Monday, Wednesday, and Friday between 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And customer service staff continue to provide a plethora of services through online means as well. Next slide, please. Council had also directed staff to return to the workplace as of January 1st, 2022 to pre-COVID workplace settings. So I do wish to provide an update on that as well. On November 23rd, Dr. Charles Gardner has issued a local letter of instruction that became effective on November 26th that requires businesses and organizations to enable remote work when able. And this letter of instruction has been provided as Appendix C. Staff will continue as directed and prepare to resume pre-COVID live settings or deviation as may be approved by council to return all town employees not working from home prior to COVID-19 to their place of work. And staff will plan to make these changes effective January 1st or thereafter, or as soon as this can be implemented while complying with provincial, federal, and Simcoe-Muskoka District Health Unit mandatory requirements. So the letter that has been provided by Dr. Charles Gardner is a letter of instruction, therefore requiring us to comply with it. I will note that the Community and Corporate Services Standing Committee meeting this evening does have a report on the agenda with a recommendation to adopt a remote work policy that is separate and apart from the hierarchy of controls required, recommended, and relative to COVID-19. So completely separate from COVID-19, and that information, as I mentioned, is on the CCS agenda for today. Next slide, please. In addition, staff have been looking at our contractor and consultant program with a lens for COVID-19 and ensuring our continued due diligence. Currently, the town does have an active screening program in place for all contractors and consultants who are required to access town facilities in person to conduct business or for the provision of services. So that program has been in place for quite some time. To ensure continued due diligence, it is recommended that the CAO continue to be responsible to determine and implement additional measures that may be warranted based on a risk profile of the contract, service, and legal or cost implications. So for example, if we had a contractor that was accessing our facilities regularly when staff were present, it may be warranted that a mandatory vaccine requirement be instilled on those contractors. If we had a contractor, though, for example, that was doing some outdoor works within their own working unit, so not interacting with town staff, potentially doing road work on the side of the road, that possibly in those instances, a mandatory vaccine policy over and above what that organization may already have in place may not be warranted. So we would look at these contracts based on risk rating when determining how our policy may apply. And the policy does reference that as well. So that is my final slide. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Executive Director. And I'll look to Deputy Clerk Dahl to see if there's anyone from our audience who would like to address this report.
Thank you, Your Worship. If there's anyone wishing to speak to the staff report, if you could please press the raise your hand feature at the bottom of the screen. And there's no one wishing to speak to this item at this time.
Thank you. So I'll read in the resolution that staff report CCS 2021-05 COVID-19 consideration of mandatory vaccination policy be received, and that the COVID-19 mandatory vaccination policy be approved. And further, that unpaid leaves of absence as referenced in the COVID-19 mandatory vaccination policy be applied based on a role risk rating as determined by the Chief Administrative Officer. And further, that the COVID-19 mandatory vaccination policy be in effect for a duration that aligns with the federal and or provincial government and the Simcoe-Muskoka District Health Unit requirements for proof of vaccination. And further, that staff plan and prepare to resume pre-COVID live settings or deviation as approved for all meetings of council, committees, and boards, and to return all town employees not working from home prior to COVID to their place of work as of January 1, 2022, and make such plans effective on January 1, 2022 or thereafter, as soon as this can be implemented, while complying with provincial, federal, and SMDHU mandatory requirements. And further, that the Chief Administrative Officer, CAO, continue to be responsible for the implementation of COVID-19 protocols and or policies as it relates to contractors and consultants based on a risk assessment approach. Can I get a mover and a seconder for that, please? Councillor Hamlin and Councillor Doherty. All right, now I'll open the floor to questions or comments from council. Councillor Berman.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. Just a general comment. This was a really well thought out and put together staff report and motion that I will not be supporting. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions or comments, Council? Councillor Jeffrey.
So thank you, Mayor Saunderson. So I've been a little bit frustrated by the pushback, albeit within the context of some chosen feedback from Simcoe-Muskoka District Health. I did a lot of research in my 2 days in Ottawa with Ontario municipalities and other municipalities all across Canada. And honestly, I didn't come across one who hadn't supported this vaccination policy of requiring the double dosing for their staffing. And a couple did acknowledge that they did lose staff in the process, but they felt their duty to be responsible for staff's health, and the residents using our facilities superseded everything else. So I won't be supporting this in its current form. I think I would require better parameters outlined in terms of role risk assessment, because I think that would basically negate the whole intent of my voting for it originally, was to protect everyone without exception. So maybe if that were just explained better, and I'll leave my comments at that right now, but I can't support it in the current form.
Maybe I'll look to Executive Director Peg. Can you explain the role risk assessment aspect for council, please?
Absolutely. Thank your worship, and through you to council. The intent of the role risk rating is to look at each of the job responsibilities prior to enacting an unpaid leave of absence. And what I mean by that is we have such a broad spectrum of services that we provide, that we have such a broad spectrum of roles that deliver them. So for example, fire and rescue services would receive a high risk rating. An individual working at a public pool as a lifeguard would receive a high risk rating. Park staff who are outside interacting with the public daily would likely receive a moderate risk rating or a high risk rating. For those types of roles, based on a risk-based approach, mandatory vaccination would absolutely be required. In a role where an individual, for example, was working primarily or completely remotely based on circumstances and of course approval through a diligent process, may not have the same risks of contracting COVID or spreading it. So in that instance, possibly not enacting an unpaid leave of absence would be warranted. I completely respect council's comments around the mandatory vaccine policy. Staff had provided the role risk rating as a consideration, but certainly if council wished to proceed with mandatory vaccination regardless of role, then staff would be happy to do so.
Thank you. Does that assist at all, Councillor Jeffrey?
It does. It would just require an amendment to remove that requirement, but I'd be curious to hear from my other colleagues before I propose it.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McLeod, I think you had your card up.
Thank you. I did, although I'm not sure that you saw Councillor Hamlin's card was up prior to mine.
Okay, well, you know what? You go ahead and I will come to Councillor Hamlin. I did not see your card, so thank you for that.
I will be proposing to take out the first and further that as an amendment when the time comes for us to do this vote. I am going to paraphrase the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, who said, if you work for the people of Canada, and by people I mean government of Canada, you will be double vaxxed. You can't get on a train today, you can't get on a plane today. And so that's where I stand on that. I also I have a question through you, Mayor Saunderson, to Executive Director Peg. You said that we have a 100% response rate on the disclosure. Do we have a 100% on vaccination then? What are the results of the disclosure, please?
Executive Director.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor McLeod. So we do have, as of last week, 92.5% of our disclosed status between staff and council are fully vaccinated. We did have some employees that have a first dose or an employee that was exploring a exemption. So total, there were 6 employees that were unvaccinated with no intent.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. And as a follow-up through you, Mayor Saunderson, when we are looking at this particular and further that with regard to role risks, are those, and I obviously am cognizant of privacy considerations. However, with regard to the role risk rating of these 6 employees, are we thinking that they are in a low role risk which is what is pushing this particular and further that in the recommended resolution?
Executive Director.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor McLeod. One of the roles of the 6 is identified as a high-risk role.
Thank you. And that brings me to another question that I have been asked to ask, and that is to do with the outside contractors. And I know you spoke about this a little bit more, but I would like through Mayor Saunderson a bit more clarification from Executive Director Peg on this issue. And so if I were a person who rented a town facility and was having a function, and a contractor for the town came into that facility and was fixing something like, I don't know, the plumbing perhaps. And do I have the right as the lessor of that particular facility to inquire about their vaccination status? If I've decided as the person who has rented it that I don't want anybody in there who's not double vaxxed?
Executive Director.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Councillor MacLeod. I will say that each circumstance would be looked at a case by case. In terms of a leased space or a contracted space, those terms would be covered within any agreement that the town entered into. And that's something that we're continuing to look at on how those contracts or lease agreements reflect our commitments in regards to COVID. There are some facilities that, regardless if it's leased or not, do require vaccine status. So if someone was renting one of our spaces for a meeting, in order to use that space, you do have to be double vaccinated. Same if there was a function taking place at a recreation facility, double vaccination would be required. The reason that the policy speaks to consultants and contractors differently is we need to do a case-by-case analysis of our current contracts to determine how that implementing something like this may or may not impact levels of service. So we do understand from some contractors that have self-disclosed that there are a number that have mandatory vaccine policies in place already, or mandatory disclosure and testing policies in place, but there may be some that don't. And we need to do an analysis of how that could impact service levels or increase costs if we're required to end contracts early or go out to RFP for new service providers. And we also recognize that there may be some cases where there is no risk. So a consultant or contractor that's fully remote based and providing services in those ways to incur a cost for ending a contract early, et cetera, through staff's analysis may not be warranted. But in terms of your specific question, it would depend on the circumstances, and certainly something that we would work with individuals renting our spaces to provide the protections that they felt were required for the meeting they were hosting. We certainly wouldn't unintentionally send someone in. And frankly, I would hope that we weren't scheduling plumbing at the same time as someone's, dress rehearsal either. So that's probably another conversation, though.
Family reunion. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate those comments and those clarifications. And I will be bringing that amendment, Mayor Saunderson, when the time comes.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you. I have a few questions having to do with how the letter that we have received from Dr. Gardner will be applied. So through you, Mr. Mayor, if this letter remains as it is right now, would that mean that council will not be returning to in-person council meetings on January the 1st?
Executive Director.
Thank you, Your Worship. I will actually defer this question to Clerk Almas, if that would be okay. And I see she's turned her camera on.
Go ahead, Clerk.
Thank you, Your Worship. We have proposed in the procedural bylaw report that we commence we're looking at right now a hybrid solution for meetings starting in January. But again, with all council members present, with a few exceptions to that. So those, when we get to that item on the agenda today, if council would like to expand those exceptions on the reason why council members themselves may wish to participate hybrid, that would be the opportunity for that conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
CEO Skinner's got a card up. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think that there's a certain amount of interpretation as well to Dr. Gardner's letter, but it does say that meetings would be remote where possible or where practical. I'm sorry, the exact words have left me. And I think in the strictest interpretation of that advice, I think Dr. Gardner would prefer and potentially would be able to enforce that meetings are remote. And I'm sure he would remove that requirement as soon as practical. That letter of instruction, I'm sorry, as soon as practical. And the way that the recommendation to council is worded is that we will be fully ready to go pending the procedural bylaw decisions as of January 1st. But should the health advice, as considered by council, indicate it prudent to remain remote for another week or two or month, we would also recommend that we do that to stay on the right side of the health advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hamlin?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. That was the main thing I wanted to know, that we were staying on the right side of Dr. Gardner's advice. So my second question, also through you, of course, is with respect to the meeting with the public tomorrow for our budget review. And I read this letter from Dr. Gardner carefully, and I'm just wondering if these things are going to be in place or if there's been any thought given to this yet. But it seems to require physical distancing of 2 meters. Face masks would be required, one-way walkways, screening of people who are attending. If we can't stay 2 meters apart with masks, in addition to a mask, we need eye protection. It's quite detailed here about members of the public assembling. So I'm just wondering if this has been taken into account for our meeting tomorrow night.
Treasurer Quinlan, I see you popped up, so I'm going to give this question to you.
I have. Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you. We have set up the meeting room to try and facilitate one-way walking. We're certainly going to have masking in place. We also have, as the library already has to take care of this as well, as we do have people that will be checking the requirement of vaccination at the door prior to entry, and we'll control the number of people that are allowed in at each time. So the rooms that we're currently going to hold the public meeting in can hold up to 30 people. I would love to see 30 people at our budget meeting tomorrow, but if we do get any more than that, we'll certainly have to sort of stagger people in, but we have thought through those things. The eye protection, I have not thought through because I didn't realize that was a new plan, but I will certainly speak to the CEO over at the library. She's been extremely helpful with this so far.
Thank you, Treasurer. Follow-up, Councillor?
Yes, just one. And with respect to the 2 meter physical distancing, even with masks, will you be able to implement that? And if it gets noisy, what will we do?
Treasurer?
I think I will. There will be a short presentation at the beginning where I'll explain, the normal physical distancing that is required. There is also signage outside of the library that states a mask must be worn and that physical distancing is still required. So I think we'll be able to keep it under control. Certainly, if we can't, we'll do our best to make some announcements or maybe split people up. And again, we're allowed to have up to 30 people in that room, and there's quite a bit of space. So I think we should be safe. We will certainly make sure we're safe in terms of the proof of vaccination and masking, of course.
Councillor?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and if I could just leave you with the thought, it would be helpful if staff could consider marking in some way that 2 meter distance. Now, I'm not sure if anyone's going to be able to hear everybody else talking 2 meters away, but I think if that's the rule, we should try and meet it. Thank you.
Council, any other questions or comments on this issue? Seeing none, then I'll go back to Councillor Jeffrey. I know that you as well as Councillor McLeod have an amendment to that second and further that which talks about the role risk. I don't know if your amendments will be similar, but I'll start with you, Councillor Jeffrey.
I think we concur that we would remove the and further that referring to role risk assessment.
The entire paragraph?
Yep. I'm just trying to look it up here again. And further that unpaid leave as referenced be applied and based on a role risk rating as determined. Yeah, so that would be removing that. And further that unpaid leave of absence is referenced in the COVID-19 mandatory vaccination policy be applied based on a role risk rating as determined by the Chief Administrative Officer.
Okay, so the entire paragraph is coming out.
Yep.
That's moved by yourself and seconded by Councillor McLeod. All right. Councillor Doherty.
Thank you. I am in agreement in principle with this amendment. However, if we take out the entire paragraph, we're also taking out all of the sanctions for any staff member that does not comply.
Well, I'll look to staff on that. It does talk about the unpaid leave of absence as set out in the policy. So if you, would that remove that as well, Executive Director, or would it leave that in place?
Thank you, Worship. Through you to Council. I certainly understand the direction that Council is providing. There would be some updates that would be required within the policy itself as well to capture the intent of Council's direction. I am certainly clear if Clerk Almas would prefer that the unpaid leaves of absence as referenced in COVID-19 mandatory vaccination policy be applied, period. That would be certainly clear. And then we would update the policy itself to reflect that direction.
Okay, and I'll look to Clerk Almas. Should we be leaving that first phrase in? Yes, okay. So the advice we're getting from staff is that if you leave in the first sentence, just reading, and further that unpaid leaves of absence as referenced in the COVID-19 mandatory policy vaccine be applied. And is that agreeable to the mover and seconder? Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions or comments on this, Council? Seeing none, then I will call the vote. All in favor? Councillor Berman?
Sorry, Mayor Saunderson, this is on the amendment?
This is on the amendment only.
Thank you.
Okay. So to be clear, then I'll call the vote again. All in favor on the amendment only. And that is carried unanimously. Thank you. So then going back then to the main motion as amended, we've had good discussion. So I will call the vote on that. All in favor? And opposed? So noted, and that is carried. Thank you for that, Executive Director. It's been a long report and a very critical one. So thank you for your work on that. And this brings us to item 5.4 T 2021-22, 2022 fees and charges. And I'm going to pass it over to Treasurer Quinlan.
Thank you, Your Worship. And through you to members of committee, we do have a short presentation on the updated 2022 rates and fees. And I can see it's coming up. And if we can flip to the next slide, please, Stephanie. Thank you. So I'll just start with an overview of the background and to remind everyone that sections 390 to 400 of the Municipal Act is what gives the town the authority to impose fees and charges on services and activities. These fees are another way, aside from taxes, to support the many services and programs that the town of Collingwood offers. And as part of our budget process on an annual basis, we do review these fees to update any reflections of changes, deletions, additions, and new additions. Sorry. Thank you. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we'll just talk about some of the benefits of a user fee-based model. And it is, of course, an important piece of cost recovery for the town, but it also increases the efficiency of services. It increases the efficiency of allocation of the service when capacity limits are reached. It improves the fairness by assigning costs to those citizens who gain most directly from that service. It improves transparency and accountability, and it provides improved information for decision makers in relation to the current and future demands for a particular service. Next slide, please. So we're going to move into some of the major changes for 2022. I will note that all fees have been updated based on the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, and that we use an average of CPI over the last 2 years. So under the general government format, we have introduced a non-resident fee for administering oaths and affidavits. Previously, it was charged at $15, or the resident fee, and it has now changed to $25. With respect to the engineering or transportation department, there are two updates. A fee for the license use of LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging data, will be charged at $300 per kilometer. This data was acquired to support modeling done as part of the master storm water study. Staff believe that this data could be helpful to the development community in planning site-specific stormwater studies. The use of this data could lead to higher quality stormwater designs, which would be a benefit to the town. And in addition to that, we would be recouping some of the costs of acquiring that data. The second piece of engineering is an increase to the subdivision legal deposit to $25,000. It was previously set at $15,000. However, staff have recognized that over the last several years, there has been an increase in the type of expenses with respect to these types of applications. And oftentimes we're having to go back to the developer for additional funds. So in this case, it would improve efficiency of that. Note, however, that of course, this is a deposit amount and not a fee. So any funds that are not used will be returned at the end of the application period. We also have introduced under Parks, Recreation and Culture, a two-tier structure that includes prime ice rental at a premium rate and off-time ice rental at a lower fee. You'll note that the prime time rental rate is at $191 per hour versus $183 in 2021. And the introduction of the off-time rental rate is at $110 per hour. Next slide, please. Within the planning department, we've included a zoning compliance certificate fee set at $40 or 25% of the building permit fee. This new certificate program will be brought into effect in 2022, and it will require applicants to obtain a zoning certificate prior to submitting a building permit application, which will achieve some efficiencies within the department. First, it will significantly improve building permit turnaround timeframes in line with legislated expectations. It provides certainty to the building permit application process. It also provides necessary applicable law approvals up front, and finally provides a record of a zoning certificate for properties that are required. Under the parking department, we've initiated parking permit fees for the harbor parking lot on a per hour and per day basis. The fee structure proposed is equal to fees already established for our other waterfront parking areas such as Sunset Point and Princeton Shores. And finally, we have changed the water and wastewater fee under construction water supply rate. Previously, it was set at a one-time flat rate of just over $100. We've changed this rate to 3 times or 90 days worth of the current average monthly rate in order to get full cost recovery. And I think next slide, please. And I think that's it. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Treasurer. I'll look to Deputy Clerk Dahl to see if there's anyone from our audience who would like to speak to this report.
Thank you, Your Worship. If there's anyone wishing to speak to the fee and service charge staff report, if you could please press the raise your hand feature. And there's no one wishing to speak to this item at this time.
Thank you, Becky. The resolution reads that staff report T 2021-22, 2022 fees and charges be received, and the council enacts and passes a bylaw to establish the 2022 fees and service charges. Can I get that moved and seconded, please? Councillor Berman and Councillor Doherty. Are there any questions or comments, Council? Councillor Berman.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. Just a quick clarification through you to Treasurer Quinlan. The one line under effect on town finances, number 5, says that fee increases have been built into the budgets for 2022. So if we tweak anything right now, does that then affect a new iteration of the budget, even if it's only a matter of pennies?
Treasurer.
Through Your Worship to Councillor Berman. Depending on the difference, yes, these fees have been incorporated into the departmental budget. That being said, of course, there's some forecasting that's involved with including that. So as long as the change wasn't incredibly significant, I don't think that we would necessarily see a change in the 2022 budget.
Okay. Councillor Doherty, I think you had your card up.
I did. Thank you. Thank you, Your Worship. And I had a few questions, and I will try not to be too granular, but I think that my questions will be more policy or reflect on policy mostly. So first of all, I am seeing a recommendation of no fee increase for transit. And we have a transit study in place that has recommended a fee increase. So I'm just wondering why the discrepancy.
Treasurer?
If I may, Your Worship, through you to Councillor Doherty. So I think at this time, because there is a current review of transit services, there was a pause. Now, if rates should decide to go up, we could bring it back in early 2022 after the overall review is complete.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So if we move on to licenses, taxis, and this is an item that I've brought up every budget, I think, that I've participated in. But we, continue to have, fairly significant increases on the various fees for taxis. Like I'm looking at, sorry, wrong line. I need a ruler on my screen here. Like a 7% increase on original application of the license instead of a CPI increase of 4%, which is where most of our other fee increases fall. I'm seeing a taxi cab owner's license waiting list, an annual fee up 15%. Now, I understand that's a little different. That's somebody who doesn't have the license yet, but even still. And what I don't see is a consideration of any kind of fee for Uber services. And it seems to me that this, our intent should be to be leveling the playing field, and we're making the discrepancy wider with these fees.
Treasurer?
Thank you, Your Worship, through you to Councillor Doherty. I don't want to speak on Manager Herrod's in place of his words, but I do believe that part of the 2022 work is to look at different options for taxi licensing. So I think I'm hearing your comments, but I will have to refer it back to Manager Herrod. Unfortunately, I don't think he's on today, so I don't think we anticipated a question regarding it. So
yeah, okay. Another question. So there are a number of fees that reference just time and materials as opposed to a fixed cost. And most of these, like as an example, lateral replacement, but it also appears several times on other departments. So it's been time and materials in 2021, and it's proposed to be time and materials in 2022. So will that in effect be a $1 increase?
Treasurer?
Thank you, Your Worship, through you to Councillor Doherty. Yes, I would suspect that in terms of the material price, especially when we talk about a water lateral service or something along those lines, that certainly the material price has likely gone up and the hourly rate as well. So there would in effect be a price increase. I think one thing we need to make note of is that, especially when it comes to those non-tax supported activities such as water, or I should say services, full cost recovery is expected or anticipated when it comes to those fees.
And so it should be, I'm just trying to get an idea of what revenue impacts we're looking at. So I'm going to move to parking fees, or actually in one docking fee. And I see, and this question, I guess, would be through you, Your Worship, to Director Culver. But based on the demand for docking and the often congested situation that we find ourselves in around our docks, why would we be reducing docking fees?
Director Culver?
I guess I should also add in the demand for docking.
So through you, sorry, I'm first of all, thank you, Your Worship, and but I'm going to apologize for leaving my camera off for connectivity issues. So I apologize in advance. So it's more of a restructuring of the docking. So we are actually increasing boat launch fees and making seasonal passes only available to residents, and we're adding in parking fees. So these are all the measures we're taking to help manage the control the parking and the congestion issues. There's a bit of you'll notice in some of the fee changes that there's a bit of a reckoning or coming to understand that the town of Collingwood taxpayers are supplementing services that are enjoyed by people coming from outside the tax base. And so all of the pricing adjustments you see sort of acknowledge that and basically ask a little bit more of non-residents to help support some of the services that the town provides. So that's why you're seeing it's more of a strategy adjustment. It's a net change upward, but it's not. But it's based on where your tax base or where you're coming from, I guess, in terms of how it's going to be applied.
Follow-up, Councillor.
No, thank you, and I absolutely get that. It's just that, in particular with docking fees, and along your line of rationalization, I would expect that most of our day dockers and season dockers would be out-of-towners as well. So here's an opportunity not only to be consistent with that, but also to be on the right side of supply and demand, in that we have waiting lists that I understand, because my brother was trying to get his boat in here, that the waiting list is quite extensive. Through you to Director Culver. Maybe you don't even have to answer that, but I'm putting it out there.
All right, well, I'll look to the director to see if he has any comments on that, and then certainly, Councillor, you're able to bring an amendment if you'd like.
Yeah. So thank you, Your Worship, and through you, I'm sorry, I'm just looking through the fees to catch up to what Councillor Doherty's pointing to make sure I'm. So recreational overnight dockage has dropped by 50 cents, but parking has been applied. So it's a net change upward, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yes, yeah, it does. I understand that. But, you know, we have a lot of people who are coming into our harbor by boat.
Right.
And then docking. And in fact, that's something I think we would like to encourage more of. So in that case, we're not going to capture any parking fees.
I understand what you're saying now. Sorry, that's yeah. So I'm gonna review this. Yeah, I feel like maybe there's a typo in here.
Okay, that would be great.
What we'll do, what I would like to do, Councillor, is just leave that in Director Culver's hands, and when it comes back to the council table for ratification, if you can highlight that and let us know if that number is a typo or if it's the number intended, and we can deal with it then.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Councillor Rorty, any other questions?
Thank you. Yes, just two more. Now this, I guess this is also to Officer Herod, and it's in regard to parking at Millennium Park. And there's there was some discussion last year that we would introduce paid parking.
Yeah, this Councillor, Officer Harrod is not here today. And I don't know if there's anybody who can take those questions. So you can put them on the table, and then if no staff is able to deal with it, we can refer them to Mr. Harrod.
Yeah, that's correct. I realize he's not there, but I did want to put the question on the table. So
Okay.
Why are we not introducing paid parking at Millennium Park this year? If we're on.
I see Treasurer Quinlan has her hand up. So Monica, go ahead.
I think actually CAO Skinner was before me, so maybe I'll let her speak first, and then we'll go from there.
All right, CAO Skinner.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think staff had thought through where it might make sense to put in paid parking, and one of the considerations really was the congestion around the boat launch and the fees that Councillor Doherty had mentioned earlier. But we did feel that it was a larger policy decision for council to decide broadly about access to the waterfront, and really felt that this may not be that a full staff report on this particular issue and parking at other waterfront locations may be warranted before we went too far into reconsidering waterfront parking and additional costs. If there may be other comments from Treasurer Quinlan and Director Culver, but certainly I felt like it was something that council would want to look at thoroughly from a number of points of view before making a decision, maybe not through a routine fee update. Thank you.
Thank you, CAO. Anything to add, Treasurer Quinlan? Director Culver, even though we can't see you.
Thank you, Worship. No, I think just sort of supporting what the CAO mentioned, the pay to play approach has been well successful in managing volumes at an organization at Sunset Point. It does come with some challenges around restricting access to some members of the public, albeit understanding that taxpayers or Collingwood taxpayers get a free pass. It's just something that to follow CAO Skinner's comment, we felt needed to be fully understood and vetted by council before throwing it into a fees and services bylaw update.
Thank you, Dean.
Okay.
Councillor?
Yes, I would look forward to a staff report on parking, paid parking for that park. Anybody who went down Heritage Drive or into the park on a weekend this past summer, it was like chock-a-block with cars parked in many cases very haphazardly. To the point where it could be a danger to pedestrians who are walking down Heritage Drive, or cyclists that are cycling down. So I would look forward to seeing that and a recommendation, hopefully. Thank you. And then just the last one, and this is directed to Director Culver, and it's in regard to the renting of tables and chairs in general. And I know this because in one of my former lives, I was renting tables and chairs from private sector, and private sector is substantially more expensive. But if people rent tables and chairs from the town, then we are competing with the private sector. And I understand why, because oftentimes it is for charitable groups and nonprofits. I'm wondering if that's exclusively for charitable and nonprofits, or if it's ever for other concerns, like as an example of for-profit events.
It relates to use on municipal properties and facilities, but I'll turn it to Director Culver.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. We only rent So going back a couple of years, and council will get tired of the refrain I keep uttering around staff capacities and trying to navigate, how to get meet all expectations. But a couple of years ago, we made a change whereby we don't rent tables and chairs sort of publicly. They're only available for rent in facilities that are being rented by a party. So it's not a matter of you can come and get chairs or tables or we'll deliver them somewhere. It's if you rent the curling club, we have an inventory of tables and chairs available for rent associated with whatever event you're hosting. And in addition to that, through an adjustment to the Culture and Recreation Grant, people can apply for in-kind support. So a not-for-profit can actually get their chairs and tables in kind once they fill out the application and go through that grant process.
Follow-up, Councillor?
Okay. No, thank you. That's a good explanation. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions or comments? Councillor Jeffrey.
Just a really quick one. Thank you, Mayor Saunderson, through to Director Culver. The hours of the reduced rate for the ice time at $110, are they hours that would be useful to youth? And if so, do we have a way of prioritizing youth? And if they're not hours that youth would use anyway, then ignore the question.
Director Culver.
Thank you, Worship. Actually, I'd like to answer the question, even though it doesn't necessarily pertain to youth directly. What we're doing with this strategy is we're incentivizing hours that are not normally desirable because we are at a more than 100% capacity in all of our desirable hours. So by encouraging, for example, a commercial group or a senior hockey group into less desirable hours, we're actually freeing up some hours that may be used by youth at the youth rate. So hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. That's great. Appreciate it.
All right, Council. Any other questions or comments on the fees? Seeing none, and then I will call the vote. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Thank you. That brings us to item 6, which is departmental updates and discussion. Do we have any departmental updates today, Deputy Clerk?
Your Worship, I'm not aware of any unless there's a director who'd like to raise their hand to speak.
I see. I'm not seeing.
Yeah, Skinner is saying no.
No. Okay, good. Thank you. So that brings us then to item 7 and item 7.1, C 2021-14 procedural bylaw review and update. This is an item that's been before council before, and we referred it back to staff. So I will pass it back to Clerk Almus for any brief update, and then open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Your
Sarah?
Worship. This report originally came to council, I believe, in September, went back to public consultation and council feedback. It was presented again, deferred till this November the 10th. We did provide the full presentation on the updates following that consultation. And then with the short notice that was provided to council, deferred to our next SIC meeting. So we're not going to review again the same PowerPoint that was presented. I would just bring to the attention of the public that one of the more substantial changes that we were looking at is the governance structure as a whole with regard to our committee programs. So right now we have our 3 standing committees, and we're recommending council look at possibility of implementing a committee of the whole, or if council doesn't have an appetite for a committee of the whole, to keep our standing committee structure status quo, only switching our meeting times of SIC and corporate community services. And from that, we will address any questions of the committee.
Thank you, Sarah. And just for a clarification on older deferred business, do I go to the public beforehand? Or is that only for staff reports?
Yes, Your Worship, you could go to the public again, but at this point we don't have any attendees.
Okay, I guess that clarifies that. So then I will read in the resolution, and it reads as follows: that staff report C 2021-14 procedural bylaw review and update be received, and council approve the recommendations contained herein, and that the Strategic Initiatives Committee direct staff to finalize the procedural bylaw for council's consideration and recommend the following governance structure. And there are two options. Option 1 is the committee of the whole, and option 2 is the standing committee status quo. But we will be switching the meetings, as the clerk indicated, with respect to corporate and community services and SIC. And so whoever moves and seconds this will have an opportunity to make the selection of the option that we will discuss before the vote. So I need a mover and a seconder, but I need the mover to indicate what option they would like to see pursued. Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, Worship. I move to support the staff recommendation committee of the whole.
All right. We have a seconder for that. Councillor Hamlin. Questions or comments, council? Seeing none, then I will call the vote. All in favor? And opposed? And that is defeated. So I'll need a new option on the table, council. Councillor McLeod.
Thank you. I have a couple of amendments in addition, but I will move option 2 with the current standing committees.
Okay, thank you. Can I get a seconder, please? Councillor Jeffrey. All right, then Councillor McLeod, I'll let you start off with your comments.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Saunderson. I have a couple of questions, and then I have a couple of amendments that I would like to provide to the body of the procedural bylaw, the text, which is actually included as part of this report. Number one, my first question is regarding item 4.19. And it actually, in the body of the staff report, it is recommended that the CAO be able to speak to a point of privilege. However, within the body of the bylaw, as presented in the staff report, there's no mention thereof. And I'm curious to know what happened there.
All right, look to Clerk Honest. Go ahead, Sarah, please.
Thank you, Worship. If I understood the question correctly, there was some initial concern regarding the ability of the CAO to provide option for the CAO to provide a point of privilege, and staff decided, as innovative as we thought that it wasn't a direction that council would be interested in, so we have actually removed that. So it's remained in the original body of the staff report. Our amendments are contained in the first part regarding the amendment section, but no, we've removed that reference.
Super, thank you. Further to my next question is regarding item in the procedural bylaw, in the text of the proposed bylaw itself, item 4.10, and it's regarding how debate takes place. There's no mention in that regarding how long a member may speak. Now, I do know that elsewhere within the procedural bylaw, the proposed procedural bylaw, there is reference made to Robert's rules, and a cursory look at Robert's rules suggests 10 minutes for members to speak, although I'm pretty sure I remember in a previous iteration of our procedural bylaw that it was limited to 5 minutes at the discretion of the chair, and a second 5 minutes was sort of your right, and then an additional 5 minutes was at the discretion of the chair. There appears to be no reference whatsoever in this amended or proposed amended bylaw to have a 5-minute limit or any discussion of timing at all. Am I correct in that suggestion? And okay, I see you nodding, and therefore I would like to insert a 5-minute limit on first speaking and the discretion of the chair for the second speaking into 410, please, 4-10. So that would be my first amendment.
All right, Councillor, and we'll deal with the amendments before we deal with the main motion. So go ahead, please.
Sorry, so Mayor Saunderson, what is it you?
I will come back to you after we've had comments from other council members.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Sure. So that's one of the amendments that I will be bringing. I will also be bringing an amendment regarding item 3.1 and 3.2 in the actual text of the procedural bylaw. In each of these cases, it's about the deletion of the roles, which has been provided in previous iterations of the procedural bylaw, and I would like to leave those in. I see no need to take them out, and but if it's the will of council, that's fine, but I would like it to be the will of council that those get taken out. And also item number 3.4 in the procedural bylaw text as well, in the second to last paragraph, it makes reference back to item 2.5 within the procedural bylaw. And this is just about the hierarchy of who does what in a situation where people are unable or unwilling to perform their duties. And I just feel as though there needs to be some consistency there. So I'd like to see that also refer back to item 2.5. And I believe those are my amendments that you will hear about in a bit.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor, any other questions or comments? Clerk Thomas, you had your hand up.
Sorry, if I can just get clarification from Councillor McLeod at 3.4.
Yes. So 3.4 is about the duty of the chair.
Yes.
And in the second to final paragraph of 3.4, it says, if the mayor/chair desires to leave the chair during a meeting for the purposes of taking part, blah, 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 blah. It just doesn't make reference back to section 2.5, but elsewhere in the proposed amended procedural bylaw, it does make reference back to 2.5. And I just from a consistency point of view, I'd like to see that.
Perfect. Thank you.
See the nod, sir. Okay. Council, other questions or comments? Councillor Jeffrey, and then Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. I don't think anything that will require amendments, but I did notice a comment in the staff report referring to the benefit of concentrating meeting time within staff working hours as opposed to after hours. And I think that comment, without being combined with the fact that you have members of council who work full-time, and we're looking forward to trying to attract younger members of council candidates. And I don't believe in that comment. While I remember a day when we used to do one day of budget on the weekend on a Saturday, which to me was more open and transparent and making things available to the public who work Monday to Friday. So we did one day in the week, one day on the weekend, and one evening at some point for public consultation. So I think planning our meetings during staff hours to save money isn't particularly the best practice for an overall performance by council. I think that probably covers both of my notes here. I do think we're really needing to work our way toward that conversation about council members becoming full-time, as opposed to trying to juggle a mix of council members with part-time and full-time, or retired with a full-time staff. And so I think that conversation is coming at us a lot sooner than what I hear it's going to, but I think it should be coming a lot sooner. So those are just my comments with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Doherty, and then I have Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just one comment, and it's in regard to requested direction. I didn't find it as an actual amendment in the bylaw, but that reports from members of council under other business should be verbal only with no visual materials. And, given that these matters come up at the end of a council meeting or nearly the end of a council meeting, it seems to me that adding visual material like PowerPoint would add interest to the report. And because the points are made so succinctly on a PowerPoint, that the report would be even more succinct. And, as compared to talking head, reading a few paragraphs, I just think it's more interesting and more engaging for members of council and the public.
Clerk Almus, do you want to respond to that?
I may look to Deputy Clerk Dahl for assistance, but it was my understanding we removed that from the community announcements section about having visuals, but under the other business, that's where if council has PowerPoint or presentation material, that would be appropriate at that time.
Just let the Deputy Clerk confirm that. Is that right, Deputy Clerk?
That's correct. Yes, you'll see the amendment in 2.10.
Okay, great. Okay, that was my misinterpretation. Other than that, I'm supportive of all of the suggested changes.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And not quite as organized as my colleagues here, but I did read through and make some comments on a few things. And so I don't always have the section numbers, which I apologize for. But one thing on my mind is the reference to Robert's Rules of Order. And I remember reading this recently. It used to say, if there's a conflict, Robert's Rules of Orders apply. And then the next version I read said that our rules should be read to be consistent with. I think that was the phrase. And I'm just wondering first if Clerk Almus could confirm if that's been changed and what it exactly says before I comment.
Sarah?
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll just have to find that provision. I know that we did modify that section to 2.2, I think. So we have where a provision is not provided to a procedural ruling within this bylaw, reference shall be made to Robert's Rules of Order for clarification on appropriate parliamentary procedure.
Right. Okay, so thank you. That's the wording. So I thought that this was not a good change. And the reason is, as it was worded before, it said if there's a conflict in two provisions, the rules of Robert's Rules apply, which makes sense. If you can't decide, you have two different sections, how do you decide? But by the wording that is there now, to my mind, it's incorporating Robert's Rules of Practice into our rules. And that would require every member to know Robert's Rules of Order. And also there may be situations where we wouldn't want those rules to apply. So I would like to move when it's the right time that we go back to if there's a conflict. Secondly, there was a removal at the beginning of the definition of striking committee, but then it was left in near the end of the rules. It mentioned why we would use the striking committee. So I just wanted to point out that was an inconsistency. I wanted to also address the agenda issue, and the staff recommendation is that we go back to getting our agendas for council meetings to Thursday at the end of the day as opposed to Wednesday. And I definitely appreciate the staff, issues about getting agendas out and addendums and so on. But I feel like we need to balance a bit, not just the needs of the staff, but the needs of the councillors. And it is the councillor's job to read these agendas. They're very lengthy. We've had incredibly lengthy agendas and reports, and to digest them and to ask questions, maybe do a little research, maybe talk to somebody in the community who has an interest. And then, holy, if we get stuck with 5 minutes to address all our issues, we're really going to be, under the gun on these things. And I just feel that really we should be pushing back the agenda. We should be getting it a week ahead. And I see so many municipalities do that, and I don't know why we have to have less time. And certainly if staff is finding there's last minute changes, couldn't things be pulled and put onto the next agenda? I don't know why there's this overriding, council only needs a couple hours to read agendas before meetings, but staff has them on their agenda for department heads 2 weeks before the agenda even comes out. So I don't know, I guess my question's through you, Mr. Mayor, to Clerk Almas. Has staff given any consideration to giving us a week to get our agendas?
Almas?
Thank you, Worship. Yes, we've bounced around, obviously, over various renditions of the procedural bylaw, changes to the time. And from the clerk services perspective, to issue addendums after an agenda has been published, does provide some problematic instances where, for example, a member of council has already printed off an agenda, should they print them still, and then ensuring that amendment is incorporated within what they've already printed and considered whenever the agenda is approved at the meeting date. At this point, I think based on our staff report processes, and if we stick to the existing structure, that I wouldn't want to, at this point, I would be wary of making it longer than what we provide already. And my apologies, maybe Deputy Clerk Dull can say 120 hours is the current notice requirement.
Looking for.
I think it's 190.
190. Thank you.
I'm just double checking.
When we looked at the provision through your worship to Councillor Hamlin regarding this, we felt 96 was actually a more consistent notice that was included within the procedural bylaws that we had been examining. And that's where we wondered if 96, would still suit council and the public's need, as well as any changes from standing committees that need to be updated into reports prior to being publishing.
It is 120 hours.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer through you, Mr. Mayor. I just feel, and I totally understand staff is currently set up in the way they are to produce agendas a few days before the meeting, but I'm going to be asking for an amendment to that section. Also, there was a section introduced about remote meetings and the hybrid situation, but as I read it, Mr. Mayor, it really doesn't allow any flexibility to council members to be remote unless there's some higher order of requirement, like health emergency. So I'm just wondering if staff had considered at all the possibility of remote meetings, that council have the ability to participate remotely if they choose. And I notice under the boards and committees section of the procedural bylaw, it does suggest that those members can participate remotely because it gives them added flexibility, and perhaps we'll have an easier time of getting volunteers on these boards and committees. And I feel the same thing applies to council members. If someone's away or visiting family, or who knows what their circumstances are, or they're just not comfortable in these ages of pandemic being back in public, that they should have some flexibility to be hybrid. And I don't know, is there any reason, through you, Mr. Mayor, and I'll ask this of our clerk, is there any reason why council could not individually be participating in a hybrid fashion?
Clerk Thomas.
Thank you, Your Worship. Again, this is a position that staff put forward, knowing that there was a resolution regarding getting back to council meetings in person. But by all means, if council wants to include an amendment to provide that flexibility, that's something that since we're exploring, we'll be implementing a hybrid meeting solution that we would be able to do much easier. So if that's the will of council, by all means, we can add that flexibility.
Follow-up, Councillor.
No, but I have another question. Thank you. Page 16. Sorry, I have to look. There's a lot in here. Oh, come on, you. Okay, so the next one I wanted to address through you, Mr. Mayor, is where council wants to bring forward a request for staff to undertake some report. And it is set out that there would be two requirements because the council member bringing forward the request would have to couch it with two whereases. One, how their request would fit in with the strategic plan of the municipality, and two, how it would fit in with the budgetary priorities / business plan of individual departments. And I found this to be quite restrictive, and I would like to bring a motion to remove those two requirements. And my reasoning is this, that in terms of the strategic plan requirements, that plan, you know, we did a high level review of it, but right now I would say it's almost 8 years old. And also with respect to the departmental budgets and priorities, although we approved it during, you know, we're going to approve it during our budget. And I had a look at the budget this afternoon to see, we had no debate or discussion on that. We have such a high level review of the budget. I mean, we spent, I don't know, an hour and a half, 2 hours with, you know, the what I've come to see is the typical, let them debate a few items that don't amount to very much money and don't raise anything else approach, which is fine. But we don't approve the priorities or the budgets. We barely get into them. So for a council member to have to figure out a departmental priority and budget around which to craft a request of staff seems to me to be an unusual requirement. And when I look forward to some of the things that the different departments are doing, so many of them, you know, that we're now working on have nothing to do with strat plans or budget priorities. And it might, you know, everything from the pilot project for Maple Street to the equity and diversity initiatives. There's so many of the things that Parks and Rec are doing. None of them came out of those, you know, budget priorities or strat plans, but rather what's happening on a particular day and what's motivating the community right now. And I believe that that's our role, to be advancing those things. Okay, so I'll bring an amendment on that one. There's a reference in the rules to the clerk bringing forward the calendar of meetings for each year on an annual basis. And I wanted to ask whether it'd be possible and this is through you, Mr. Mayor, to our clerk, to have a time when that schedule is released and for example, November 1st. I have just found it personally difficult to make a plan for the next year if we're not getting a schedule till, you know, January. So through you, Mr. Mayor.
Thomas.
Certainly, Your Worship, that's something we could do. We've actually had one ready to go probably since before the 1st of November. We just knowing that we had this staff report outstanding, and if we changed our structure, haven't issued it. So following the deliberation on the meeting at times, that's something we can completely do.
Okay, thank you. That's fantastic. And in a similar fashion, I totally agree with having the flexibility for council meetings in August when there's a lame duck period preceding an election. I'm just wondering again through you, Mr. Mayor, to our clerk, when seeing August is our holiday month, it would be nice to know as soon as possible what 2 weeks would be kept clear for meetings as being proposed by staff. And I'm just wondering when you might have an idea of when we could be told that.
Thomas?
Well, certainly, we do have a draft calendar prepared right now, and we'd be looking at the first 2 weeks of August and leaving the last 2 weeks of August free.
Oh, thank you. That's fantastic. There's on the motion to defer, I was wondering if we could add in the same words that we have to do with, I think it's for a referral, but anyway, the words would be that the counselor provide a brief and concise statement on the reasons for providing a deferral. There's nothing in that rule that outlines what, if anything, a counselor is allowed to say when they're asking for a deferral. And
so, Councillor, on a deferral, there's no discussion, and on a referral.
no, but so this is my question, Mr. Mayor. If you're the counselor bringing forward the request for a deferral, should there not be a reason given?
I'll look to the clerk to explain. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah, please.
Definitely. Thank you, Your Worship. To Councillor Hanlon's question, a motion to defer is to defer to a specific time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's generally a component of Robert's Rules of Order that then there's no debate on it. It's clearly deferring it to a specific time, whereas a motion to refer provides a member of council the ability to say what the matter is being referred for. Is it being referred to staff for further information? Is it being referred back to committee for conversation? But defer doesn't change any sort of amendment or further consideration to changes in what the report would be. For example, if it was a deferral of a staff report.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, so if a counselor wants to ask a specific matter to be deferred, how do they explain to rest of council why?
Clerk Thomas.
Certainly, I believe at the outset, and generally how we have it is before a motion is deferred, it goes around the table. I'd have to just double check my section here. However, you can make a statement before, but once a motion goes on the floor, then there's no debate to it. So before the motion is put on the floor, if you're wanting to defer it and saying, I'll be putting a motion to defer, and then once the chair calls that the motion and has a seconder, then there is no debate on the motion. So prior, as you're introducing the information on having a deferral, then you can provide your comment at that time.
Okay, thank you. That's great. I understand. My next question is with respect to the agendas for in-camera meetings. And I know this has been an evolving situation because certainly 3 years ago, there were barely agendas and never a report. And so I'm so happy with how things have evolved. So take this as thank you. But I'm just wondering if there's, again, through you, Mr. Mayor, is there any reason why we couldn't have a deadline for when those agendas and reports would be provided to us prior to an in-camera session?
Sarah?
Thank you, Your Worship. To Councillor Hamlet's question, if Council would like to impose a deadline, you may make an appropriate amendment.
Okay, thank you. Okay. And I'll just leave this for your review. I won't address it, but it just seemed to me in paragraph 7.4, there was some inconsistency because it mentioned both 3-year terms and 4-year terms for committees, but we don't need to discuss it. I'll just leave it with you. And 8.2 had to do with attendances by solicitors. Let me just look at that because I was very unhappy with that. Right. Council show, what this refers to is town solicitor report to council first available opportunity on any action taken if they have to take some action. And I'm just wondering, I know that recently our solicitor attended at a pre-hearing at the Ontario Land Tribunal, which is the former OMB, whatever. And he didn't come to, I don't believe we've discussed the matter in camera at all yet. And a resident who appeared said to me that the solicitor was there and was able to say he had no instructions because he hadn't, been to council and so on and so on. I won't get into the details, but it did strike me that there'd always be time for a solicitor to get instructions from council before he trotted off to an Ontario Land Tribunal or so I'm just wondering, how do we enforce that through you, Mr. Mayor? Do we give directions to our legal counsel in this regard? Thank you.
Thomas.
My apologies, Your Worship, to Councillor Hamlin. Which section was that?
Oh, well, this is 8 is the legal actions. And so 8.2, well, 8.1 was town solicitor can go off and do anything if it's appropriate, commence or defend any proceeding. And number 2 is if he does that, he has to then come and tell us. But I'm just wondering where appearing at Ontario Land Tribunals without getting instructions fits in. Maybe that's my question. Thank you.
Like this is a procedural aspect in terms of the procedural bylaw, and then there's maybe a question on a specific file that you might want to take offline. In terms of the procedure, as in the procedural bylaw, Clerk Thomas, can you provide some assistance?
I'm going to have to, my apologies, take this one offline and maybe have a conversation with Councillor Hamlin, and I'll add an amendment to the staff report when it comes back to council to see if there needs to be any change to that section. I may need to utilize the assistance of Director Valentine too for a better understanding of some of those processes.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your indulgence, Mr. Mayor.
All right, so we have a number of amendments, and I'm mindful of the time. It's 10 to 5, and there's a corporate and community services meeting coming up. So we'll do our best to address this item, and we will not get to the code of conduct today. So we'll have to defer that to another meeting. Before I get into the what we have on the floor is the main motion with option 2, but we have a number of amendments. Councillor Jeffrey, I'll start with you.
I don't remember an amendment, Mayor Saunderson. It's been so long.
Did I write them down? Or maybe perhaps it was Councillor McLeod. I'm sorry. It's my
That's
memory
okay.
that's going.
No, it could have been mine.
Councillor McLeod, you had a number of amendments. So
Thank you. Yes. Yes. So I have 4. Number 1 is actually, I have 3 actually.
I have my notes.
The first one is that item under the text of the procedural bylaw 3.1 and 3.2, that the roles of the mayor and the roles of council be left in the text of the bylaw.
All right, and I'll look for a seconder for that. Thank you. And we've had good discussion all around. So unless there's a really important point specific to this amendment, I'm not seeing any, then I will call the vote. All in favor? And that is carried unanimously. Thank you. What's your next amendment, Councillor?
Under 3.4 in the text of the procedural bylaw, the second to last paragraph needs to make reference back to 0.2.5. It's kind of just housekeeping.
I'll look for a seconder on that, and I think during the discussion on that, Clerk Thomas was nodding her head in agreement. So then I will call the vote on this amendment then. All in favor? That is carried unanimously. Thank you. And your third amendment?
Is under item 4.10 that debate be limited or comments be limited to 5 minutes during the course of debate on a motion from each member, and that an additional 5 minutes can be provided at the discretion of the chair once all members have exhausted their opportunity to speak.
All right, and do we have a seconder for that? Councillor Berman, thank you. Any questions or comments on this item, Council? Councillor Hamlin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It just strikes me that our roles sitting here are to express the views as elected representatives, and maybe also provide thoughts of our residents or businesses, as the case may be. And that we allow our residents 10 minutes to speak, and I don't know why we need to control this with set time limits and a timer. I think if the chair of the meeting decides someone is repeating themselves, that's their prerogative to cut off discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Jeffrey.
Thank you, Mayor Saunderson. I just wanted a little bit of clarification from Councillor McLeod. So is it the intent that we're trying to keep the 5 + 5, but if a member still needed more time after everyone else has spoken, they could come back with more time after the total of 10, or everything's to be contained in that 10?
My thought was, sorry.
Through you, Mayor.
And my reply through you, Mayor Saunderson, is that my intention here is that a member may have 5 minutes of the floor, and that each member may have 5 minutes of the floor. At the discretion of the chair, they may have an additional 5 minutes of the floor.
Any other questions or comments, Councillor Comey? I think I saw your card up there. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I suppose I would just offer the comment similar to Councillor Hamlin's. I mean, our members of the public at 10 minutes. I think we have to be wary of any type of unintended ableism that can come with that comment. While it's wonderful if people are succinct, it's not a requirement. I mean, we're elected officials, we're put here by members of the community. Some people maybe are put here because they're very long-winded and like to say things or speak particularly slowly. And then my other comment is that I really dislike the idea of one elected official having the ability to potentially limit, or, I mean, you could certainly use the word censor or cut off another elected official's comments. I think we're accountable to the public more so than necessarily each other on these matters. Thank you.
Thank you. Clerk Thomas, I have a question for you. There was previously in the rules a 5-minute limit. I'm just wondering about the evolution of that.
And my apologies, Your Worship. I can't specifically require, but I felt that I believe it evolved because 5 minutes, depending on what the content of the discussion was not sufficient. So it was removed.
And when was it removed? Just for a sense of timing, please.
I would believe, I think prior to 2016.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions or comments, Council? Seeing none, then I'll call the vote. All in favor? Opposed? So noted, and that is carried. And that, I think, is your 3 amendments, Councillor McLeod. And so, Councillor Hamlin, you had 3, maybe 4 amendments. So turning it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Firstly, on the question of Robert's Rules of Order, I don't think I'll make a motion with respect to that. I would like instead just to leave this question with Clerk Almas for her to determine what substantive change we've made by changing those words. Thank you. With respect to the attendance on a hybrid basis, as staff and our committee members will be allowed, I wanted to make a motion to add to 4.27, that individual council members can also attend remotely if necessary for personal reasons.
Do we have a seconder for that? Thank you, Councillor Comey. Any questions or comments, Council? I do have a question through Clerk Almas. I'm just wondering, as we work our way through COVID, I would imagine that the hybrid model, as long as we are battling COVID, may apply in some form for medical reasons. So maybe then I need some clarification from Councillor Hamlin. Are you envisioning that this would happen when, in a perfect world, when we no longer are wrestling with COVID and have other health issues facing us, that a council member could simply, for convenience, ask that they be accommodated on a hybrid basis?
Well, that's a really good question. And right now, all I'm thinking about is the pandemic, honestly. Who knows, like in the future, maybe someone's bedridden but would still like to, I don't know, but I'm not addressing that today.
Okay, well then I'm going to look to staff just to get clarification. Under the policy as it's prepared, is this motion necessary to accommodate the COVID situation?
I do not believe so, Your Worship. I think we have that within our provisions.
Okay, thank you. So with that answer, Councillor Hamlin, do you still want to pursue your amendment?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Nextly, in terms of the publishing of the agenda, I can see this as not going to find favor. So I think what I'd like to propose with this is that we not change the time by which council gets the agenda before the meeting. I think staff has suggested that we get one less day. And I would like, and I don't know what section that is, I'm sorry, but I wanted to move that we get the same time as we have now.
Okay, thank you. So that's remaining at 120 hours. And is there a seconder, please? All right, then I will call the vote then. All in favor? And opposed? So that is defeated.
Okay, you know what? I don't care. That's it, I'm done.
Okay, then that brings us to the main motion, Council, and we're going, as I indicated before, with option 2, which is the standing committee status quo with the switching of the times for the corporate community services in the SIC. Call the vote then. All in favor? And opposed? So noted. And that is carried. All right, Council, it's 5 o'clock.
Did we have discussion on that last motion? Sorry. Was there a discussion on that?
On the main motion?
No, on the changing of the times? Was that a separate matter?
Well, that was, no, it's part of the option. So in your agenda, Councillor, it had option 1 and option 2 for the standing committee structure, and Councillor Doherty had moved for option 1, committee of the whole, and that was defeated, and that brought us to section 2. And then we dealt with that. Once that motion was on the floor, we went through the number of amendments and questions about it. So when I called the main motion, that would have been the opportunity to address that.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Councillor Doherty.
Thank you, Your Worship. So just a point of order. I accidentally voted twice. I hope you caught that.
I didn't. So, well, I saw your no card the first time up and then you voted no again, or did you change your vote?
No, I voted yes when you called the question just now, but I meant to vote no.
Okay, well, I had 3 no's, yourself, Councillor Comey, and Councillor Hamlin. So
then we're good.
I don't know that you're included as a yes. So I'll just look to the clerk. Was Councillor Doherty a no?
Correct.
Okay. So I think we got you correctly recorded.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Council. So we will defer item 7.2. And before we're shortly after 5, but I will look to the clerk to see if there's anyone from our audience that would like to make a 5-minute delegation.
Thank you, Your Worship. There's no one in the audience at this time.
Okay, thank you. So with that being the case, then I will look for a motion to adjourn. Councillor Jeffrey, thank you very much. I will call the question. All in favor? Thank you, Council. That was a busy agenda, and we got a lot accomplished. And I will look to Chair McLeod to give us an indication of when she'd like to start the Corporate Community Services meeting.
Thank you. It is 5:04 right now. If the committee is amenable, I would like to begin that meeting at 5:15. Is that possible? That gives you 10 minutes to scarf something down and take a bio break.
Good. So then I will see the Corporate and Community Services Standing Committee in 11 minutes. And everybody else, thank you very much for your attention and hard work today. And thank you to staff. These were a lot of big projects that have been rolling around. So thank you very much to everybody.